Chapter 1. April 25, 1945. You ready to shoot some Nazis out of the sky? Ken Stevens, a tall slim man with blonde hair and green eyes, looked at his closest friend, Richard McGregor. He and Richard had met in basic training, and had been instant friends. Their faith helped to bind them together, but they found it often kept them apart from the other men of their unit. Richard shook his head, his regulation-cut red hair slicked against his head. Not before we pray. Ken smiled and nodded. He hadn't forgotten. Every time they went up in the air, they spent some time praying together first. You want to do the honors this time? They bowed their heads together while Richard prayed. Lord, help guide our planes so we may bring glory to you and to our country. Please watch over the families we've left behind so that we may serve. We thank you for the opportunity you have given us to come before you in prayer and for keeping us alive thus far. Please help us to survive. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Ken echoed the amen. He glanced at his friend and asked, You got your picture? Richard held up the photograph of his wife and two young children he kissed before each battle they fought in. The two young men were fighter pilots for the U.S. Air Corps. Their assignment for the morning was flying escort for the bombers who would be taking out several military targets in Hellen, Austria. One of the targets that day was the mountain retreat of Hitler himself. Somehow in Ken's head, the name Hitler had come to be synonymous with Satan. It was still dark as they piled with three other men into a truck to be transported to the town of Cromer on the British coast. From there they would fly south toward Austria. The mission would take around 8.5 hours round trip to get to their target and return home. The two friends sat together, and Richard showed Ken his latest letter from home. Ken read it as the truck bounced along toward their destination. He laughed at some of the antics it said Richard's son was up to. His son, Ronald, was 5 and his daughter, Carol, was 3. He knew their birthdates as well as he knew his own. He'd been with Richard when the telegram arrived, letting him know his daughter was born. They'd both enlisted on December 8, 1941. The men hadn't seen another option for themselves other than defending their country against the Nazis. I'm going to shoot down more than you do today, Richard bragged. Ken laughed softly. You're just going to see the dust from my guns, because I'll outshoot you 2-1 like I always do. Richard poked his friend. You've never outshot me, and you know it. Compared to you, I'm an ace. Ken didn't know how he would have been able to stand the past 2 years without his friend at his side. Being a Christian made it hard for him to fit in with the other soldiers who thought any time off meant they should drink themselves into a stupor. Richard was like him, and they spent their time telling stories of growing up. Richard was from Michigan. He'd grown up in Detroit. Ken was from Minnesota. He was the son of a dairy farmer who was used to having his family surround him during any time of need. Richard hadn't been raised in a Christian family, but had been saved when he was a teenager. He'd met his wife, Irene, through some mutual friends who thought they'd be a good couple. He'd told Ken all about their first meeting, which had included another couple and a fun night of board games in the other couple's home. For him, it had been love at first sight, and he'd immediately started to think of her as his future wife. When they reached the airfield, the two men embraced and Richard said the same thing he always said to Ken before they flew. If I don't make it, take care of my family. Ken agreed, making the same promise he always made. Why wouldn't he? Nothing could happen to them. They were part of the mighty 8th Air Force, and they were invincible. Fly straight. Ken jogged to his plane and looked over at Richard. They watched over each other in the air as well as watching the bombers. They both knew it would be hard to go on without the other. He watched as Richard kissed the photograph of Irene and the kids before saluting him. He saluted back and checked his instrument panel for takeoff. The first part of the flight was routine. They flew over the English Channel, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Germany, and Austria. They flew for over 4 hours before reaching their targets. Ken and Richard's jobs, as escorts, were to fly their P-51 Mustangs alongside the bombers and keep the bombers safe. The usual German response was to ignore the escort and target the bombers, so they knew they would probably be safe, but they would have to do some shooting of their own weapons. When Ken had first realized he'd be flying one of the powerful Mustangs, he'd been nervous about it, but once he'd actually flown one, he'd felt it fit him as well as any suit he'd ever worn. It was as if the plane became an extension of him, and flying it was as easy as walking. He knew the only thing he'd miss about being in the Air Corps was the feel of the airplane around him as he flew, but it was something he'd happily give up to go home again. Ken had never encountered such heavy anti-aircraft fire as he did during the ensuing battle. Dark smoke filled the air from the flak. Ken searched frantically through the air, but he couldn't make out his own wings, let alone the bombers they flew with or Richard's plane. He flew blindly through the smoke, praying silently he wouldn't hit another plane. After what seemed like hours, but was in fact mere minutes, they emerged from the smoke. He looked to his right, where Richard's plane should have been, but it was gone. After a frenzied search and a frantic call over the radio, he realized his friend was lost. The tears streamed down Ken's face as they made the long flight back to Britain and the base. He knew he'd never get the sight of the black smoke that had taken his friend out of his mind. Whether he'd been shot down or experienced trouble with his plane, Ken may never know, but he would do his best to live up to the promise he'd made Richard. Back in the Quonset hut, which served as their barracks, he carefully went through Richard's things to pack them to return to Richard's wife, Irene. In the middle of his locker, he found a letter with his name printed in Richard's careful script on the envelope. Sitting down on his cot, trying to hide his tears from the others, he opened the letter and removed a sheet from the envelope. There was another sealed envelope inside the first, with Irene printed on it. Ken, if you're reading this letter, it means I've either been wounded in action, and you're packing up my things to go home to my wife, or I've gone home to Jesus. If I didn't make it, I want you to know that you're the best friend I've ever had. Without you beside me, both in our barracks and in the air, life would have been unbearable here. Remember your promise to take care of Irene and the kids for me. I trust you. I hope you never have to read this, but I'm not going to take any chances. Please see that Irene gets the letter I wrote her. With Christ's love, Richard. Ken stared down at the unopened letter to Irene and carefully packed it with his things. He'd deliver the letter personally as soon as he was stateside. He didn't know how he'd take care of Irene and the kids, but he'd make sure they had food and enough money to get by before going home to Minnesota. Slowly he stood and finished packing up Richard's things. He sealed the box with everything but the letter meant for Irene, and took it to their captain. He'd see to it that it was sent home for Richard's wife, not that it would do her any good. He wished he knew how to take care of a woman and 2 children he'd never met. His heart ached as he knew that his friend's family wouldn't know for a couple of days that he'd been lost over Austria. He wished he could be there to tell Irene in person, because he knew Richard so well. A telegram was so impersonal. When he returned to his cot, he said a long silent prayer for his friend's family, pleading with God to watch over them until he was back stateside and could do the job. It was his last wish I take care of them, but I can't do it until I get home. Please, God help this terrible war to end quickly, and let me go home to take care of his wife and kids. It's my duty as his friend, and I'll do it with a smile. Ken had never been to Michigan, but there was no doubt in his mind that he'd be there soon. He only hoped he could find the right words to say to a grieving widow. Chapter 3. It took Ken only 15 minutes to walk back to his hotel. All he could think about was climbing into the bed and sleeping for 12 hours straight. It was only 4 in the afternoon, but he reached for the alarm clock on the bedside table, wound it and set it for 9 in the morning. He was tired enough he wasn't sure he would get up before then on his own. He closed his eyes, and tried to sleep, but all he could see were Irene's sad eyes. She'd made it clear she didn't want his help, but he'd made a promise to Richard and he was going to keep it no matter what. But how? He bowed his head and prayed, both for sleep to come and for a way to help Richard's family. There had to be something he could do to help them. As soon as he finished the prayer, the answer was in his mind, but was it the right one? Could he really ask the widow of his closest friend to marry him so soon after his friend's death? He yawned, knowing he wasn't going to come up with anything better while he was so tired, and let himself finally drift into the oblivion of sleep. It was still dark out when he sat up straight in bed, panting as he fought his way out of the dream. The black smoke was surrounding him, and Richard was in his plane with him, telling him he had to take care of his family. He stared straight ahead, knowing the only answer was to ask Irene to marry him. He had a small house in the town of Hudspeth, Minnesota. It wasn't yellow, but if Irene wanted a yellow house, he could certainly paint it. It was only 3 bedrooms, but it was certainly enough for the 4 of them. I'll ask her. As soon as he said the words aloud, a sense of peace came over him. It was as if that's what Richard had wanted him to do all along. He sighed. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he had to do it. If she said no, then maybe it wasn't God's will. He got up and went into the bathroom to relieve himself and take a long hot bath. He was hungry, but there was nowhere to get food that early in the morning. He'd have to wait until the hotel restaurant opened at 6. Once he'd bathed and shaved, he dressed again in his dress uniform. He glanced at the clock, and saw that it was just before 6, so he could go down and get breakfast. While he was there, he'd ask for information on how long he'd have to wait to marry. He'd never gotten married before, and had never even seriously thought about it. There had been no women he'd been interested in courting before the war, but he hadn't been in a hurry. He was only 21 when the war broke out, and then he'd done what he needed to do. By the time he left to go to lunch with Irene and the kids, he was armed with information on how to get married in Detroit. He felt like a load was off his shoulders now that he'd made the decision to ask her. Once he'd asked, the decision would be hers, but he would be able to say in good conscience that he'd done everything he could. He honestly wasn't sure if he wanted her to say yes or no. He knew he'd eventually want to marry, but he was only 25 and wasn't in a huge hurry. He liked Irene, and had heard wonderful things about her from Richard, so he knew she'd make a good wife if she said yes, but he had no real feelings for her other than compassion. She was pretty, but he knew even if they did marry, he wouldn't try to consummate the marriage until she was ready, and with her husband dying so recently, he knew she wouldn't be ready for a long time. When he reached her door, he knocked quickly. She opened the door, dressed in a blue dress, with her hair pulled back away from her face. She wore no lipstick, which he liked. He found the painted lips of modern women too bright for his tastes. The kids were behind her, ready for their outing. He wanted to ask her before they left, though, so he asked, "Could you step outside with me for a moment?" "Without the kids?" "I have something I want to talk to you about." She eyed him curiously, stepping onto the porch after admonishing the children to behave. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what Richard wanted. He asked me to take care of you and the kids. There's really only one way I can do that, and that's by marrying you. How about it?" Her mouth tilted up at the corner. "Is that supposed to be a marriage proposal?" He had the grace to blush. "Well, I'm not good with words, but I'm sincere. I'd like to marry you. I have a little house in Minnesota that would be big enough for the 4 of us." He scrambled for the best way to word what he wanted to say. "I wouldn't ask you to share a room with me right off. Not till you were ready." "I'm not ready for that." She stared at him a moment as if she were trying to determine if he was sure. "You don't have a girl back in Minnesota waiting for you to come home and sweep her off her feet?" He laughed. "No girl who's ever known me would expect that. I'm not the sweep a girl off her feet type." He held his hat in his hands as he talked to her. "I know it would please Richard if I married you. He was like a brother to me and the best friend I've ever had. So, I want to marry you." She bit her lip, obviously considering his words. "Okay, I'll marry you. When do you need to leave to go home to Minnesota?" "I was hoping to leave tomorrow. I have enough money for train tickets for all of us, and we can have your things shipped." She nodded solemnly. "I think it's the best thing for the kids. They deserve a father." She was surprised at how calm she was at the idea of marrying him. She'd expected to feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't. "I promise you, I'll treat them just like they were my own. I feel like I know them already from your letters." Her eyes widened. "You read my letters?" He nodded. "Richard and I always swapped letters from home. It made us both feel better. He liked the letters from my family, because his wasn't Christian. I loved all the stories you told about the kids. They made me think of my younger brother and sisters and made me laugh. He looked up at the sky. It's hard to find things to laugh about living in the barracks. I understand. I'm sure my preacher will be willing to marry us this afternoon. Do we need to let your parents know? He didn't want to offend his future in-laws. Family was too important to him for that. I'll talk to them this evening. Are they here in town? He asked, opening the door so she could call the kids to come with him. He wondered if he was happy or sad she'd accepted his proposal. He really wasn't sure. He was happy to be able to help her, of course, but he didn't know how he felt about having an instant family. They walked the short distance to the cafe, with the children walking along happily between them. Once they were seated and had placed their order, Irene explained calmly that she would be marrying Ken. Ronald looked at Ken with wide eyes. You're going to be our new daddy? Ken nodded slowly. He hadn't really thought about being a father. He'd just thought about marrying their mother and helping out financially. He guessed he'd be a father, though. He really looked at the kids for the first time. They seemed polite and well-behaved. He'd always had so much family around that having children had always felt like something he'd do, but he hadn't thought about it a lot. Is that okay with you? Ronald seemed to consider it for a moment. I think so. I think you'll like my house and my family. My mama is going to be really excited to be a grandma. Ronald looked at his mother. I'll get a new grandma, too? Irene nodded uncertainly. I guess you will. Ken shrugged. I come with grandparents and aunts and uncles and lots of cousins. Even great-grandparents. Irene's eyes widened. Do they all live close? Yeah. Well, one of my aunts lives in South Dakota, but she makes it out at least once a year for family stuff. My dad's other 6 brothers and sisters are all in the same area. And most of my cousins. I think I have 1,000 cousins sometimes. He smiled as he talked about his large extended family. He loved the chaos they brought. Irene bit her lip as if worried. What will they think of you showing up with a wife and kids you want them to just accept? Ken laughed, shaking his head. They'll take it in stride. My mother and grandmother were both mail-order brides. Trust me, my family won't think it's strange at all for me to come home with a wife and 2 kids. They'll just welcome you with open arms. He paused for a moment, looking at her. What will your parents think? She shrugged. They'll think I'm doing the right thing. Her brows drew together. It's my in-laws I'm worried about. They'll think I'm being disrespectful to Richard's memory. They won't care if Richard wanted this or not. She shrugged, as if she didn't care, but he could see she really did. He reached across the table and took her hand in his. The good news is, if they don't approve, you'll be living in another state, and there's not a lot they can do about it. She smiled and nodded. That's true. And she wouldn't be alone any longer. Having someone help her protect the children seemed like a dream come true. After lunch, could we head straight to your preacher's house and get the marriage handled? Then maybe I can meet your parents, so they don't worry that I'll mistreat you and the kids. She looked worried. They're very strict Christians, and somehow feel that Richard failed me by not leaving me enough money to survive without him. Trust me. They won't worry. Ken shook his head. They don't understand he was doing what needed to be done? That he served his country? She shook her head. They didn't think he should enlist. If he'd been drafted, I'm sure they would feel differently, but they felt with him being married, having a son and another child on the way, his duty was to us, and not to his country. Her eyes met his. They'll think you did the right thing, because you were single, but they just couldn't agree with Richard's decision. Well, we'll go meet them after the wedding. Or do you want to have them there? I'd rather it just be us. It'll be hard enough explaining everything that happened afterward. He nodded, understanding. He wished she'd had the unconditional support he'd always felt growing up, but he understood why she felt the way she did. We'll do it that way then. After their meal, they all walked to her pastor's house. On the way she explained, I go to a different church than my parents. When we married, I joined Richard's church. My church growing up was very strict, and in my opinion, too judgmental. So many people don't realize that Christians can see things in different ways, and what's wrong for one isn't necessarily wrong for another. She paused and looked over at him. They were walking with the children between them. The new church is a lot better about things like that. My town is small enough that there's only one church, but I've never found the people to be overly judgmental. Of course, half the congregation is my family. She shook her head. The more you talk about your family, the more intimidated I feel. That's a lot of people for me to meet and get along with. Don't feel intimidated by my family, he told her. They'll welcome you with no problem. You'll have a house full of family whenever you want, but when you don't want them there, they'll leave. You'll see. It'll be good. She looked skeptical as she turned to walk up to the front of a house. This is where Pastor Sheldon lives. Chapter 3. It took Ken only 15 minutes to walk back to his hotel. All he could think about was climbing into the bed and sleeping for 12 hours straight. It was only 4 in the afternoon, but he reached for the alarm clock on the bedside table, wound it and set it for 9 in the morning. He was tired enough he wasn't sure he would get up before then on his own. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but all he could see were Irene's sad eyes. She'd made it clear she didn't want his help, but he'd made a promise to Richard and he was going to keep it no matter what. But how? He bowed his head and prayed, both for sleep to come and for a way to help Richard's family. There had to be something he could do to help them. As soon as he finished the prayer, the answer was in his mind, but was it the right one? Could he really ask the widow of his closest friend to marry him so soon after his friend's death? He yawned, knowing he wasn't going to come up with anything better while he was so tired, and let himself finally drift into the oblivion of sleep. It was still dark out when he sat up straight in bed, panting as he fought his way out of the dream. The black smoke was surrounding him, and Richard was in his plane with him, telling him he had to take care of his family. He stared straight ahead, knowing the only answer was to ask Irene to marry him. He had a small house in the town of Hudspeth, Minnesota. It wasn't yellow, but if Irene wanted a yellow house, he could certainly paint it. It was only 3 bedrooms, but it was certainly enough for the 4 of them. I'll ask her. As soon as he said the words aloud, a sense of peace came over him. It was as if that's what Richard had wanted him to do all along. He sighed. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he had to do it. If she said no, then maybe it wasn't God's will. He got up and went into the bathroom to relieve himself and take a long hot bath. He was hungry, but there was nowhere to get food that early in the morning. He'd have to wait until the hotel restaurant opened at 6. Once he'd bathed and shaved, he dressed again in his dress uniform. He glanced at the clock, and saw that it was just before 6, so he could go down and get breakfast. While he was there, he'd ask for information on how long he'd have to wait to marry. He'd never gotten married before, and had never even seriously thought about it. There had been no women he'd been interested in courting before the war, but he hadn't been in a hurry. He was only 21 when the war broke out, and then he'd done what he needed to do. By the time he left to go to lunch with Irene and the kids, he was armed with information on how to get married in Detroit. He felt like a load was off his shoulders now that he'd made the decision to ask her. Once he'd asked, the decision would be hers, but he would be able to say in good conscience that he'd done everything he could. He honestly wasn't sure if he wanted her to say yes or no. He knew he'd eventually want to marry, but he was only 25 and wasn't in a huge hurry. He liked Irene, and had heard wonderful things about her from Richard, so he knew she'd make a good wife if she said yes, but he had no real feelings for her other than compassion. She was pretty, but he knew even if they did marry, he wouldn't try to consummate the marriage until she was ready, and with her husband dying so recently, he knew she wouldn't be ready for a long time. When he reached her door, he knocked quickly. She opened the door, dressed in a blue dress, with her hair pulled back away from her face. She wore no lipstick, which he liked. He found the painted lips of modern women too bright for his tastes. The kids were behind her, ready for their outing. He wanted to ask her before they left, though, so he asked, "Could you step outside with me for a moment?" "Without the kids?" "I have something I want to talk to you about." She eyed him curiously, stepping onto the porch after admonishing the children to behave. What is it? He took a deep breath. I've been thinking about what Richard wanted. He asked me to take care of you and the kids. There's really only one way I can do that, and that's by marrying you. How about it? Her mouth tilted up at the corner. Is that supposed to be a marriage proposal? He had the grace to blush. Well, I'm not good with words, but I'm sincere. I'd like to marry you. I have a little house in Minnesota that would be big enough for the four of us. He scrambled for the best way to word what he wanted to say. I wouldn't ask you to share a room with me right off. Not till you were ready. I'm not ready for that. She stared at him a moment as if she were trying to determine if he was sure. You don't have a girl back in Minnesota waiting for you to come home and sweep her off her feet? He laughed. No girl who's ever known me would expect that. I'm not the sweep a girl off her feet type. He held his hat in his hands as he talked to her. I know it would please Richard if I married you. He was like a brother to me and the best friend I've ever had. So, I want to marry you. She bit her lip, obviously considering his words. Okay, I'll marry you. When do you need to leave to go home to Minnesota? I was hoping to leave tomorrow. I have enough money for train tickets for all of us, and we can have your things shipped. She nodded solemnly. I think it's the best thing for the kids. They deserve a father. She was surprised at how calm she was at the idea of marrying him. She'd expected to feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't. I promise you, I'll treat them just like they were my own. I feel like I know them already from your letters. Her eyes widened. You read my letters? He nodded. Richard and I always swapped letters from home. It made us both feel better. He liked the letters from my family, because his wasn't Christian. I loved all the stories you told about the kids. They made me think of my younger brother and sisters, and made me laugh. He looked up at the sky. It's hard to find things to laugh about living in the barracks. I understand. I'm sure my preacher will be willing to marry us this afternoon. Do we need to let your parents know? He didn't want to offend his future in-laws. Family was too important to him for that. I'll talk to them this evening. Are they here in town? He asked, opening the door so she could call the kids to come with him. He wondered if he was happy or sad she'd accepted his proposal. He really wasn't sure. He was happy to be able to help her, of course, but he didn't know how he felt about having an instant family. They walked the short distance to the cafe, with the children walking along happily between them. Once they were seated and had placed their order, Irene explained calmly that she would be marrying Ken. Ronald looked at Ken with wide eyes. You're going to be our new daddy? Ken nodded slowly. He hadn't really thought about being a father. He'd just thought about marrying their mother and helping out financially. He guessed he'd be a father, though. He really looked at the kids for the first time. They seemed polite and well-behaved. He'd always had so much family around that having children had always felt like something he'd do, but he hadn't thought about it a lot. Is that okay with you? Ronald seemed to consider it for a moment. I think so. I think you'll like my house and my family. My mama is going to be really excited to be a grandma. Ronald looked at his mother. I'll get a new grandma, too? Irene nodded uncertainly. I guess you will. Ken shrugged. I come with grandparents and aunts and uncles and lots of cousins. Even great-grandparents. Irene's eyes widened. Do they all live close? Yeah. Well, one of my aunts lives in South Dakota, but she makes it out at least once a year for family stuff. My dad's other 6 brothers and sisters are all in the same area. And most of my cousins. I think I have 1,000 cousins sometimes. He smiled as he talked about his large extended family. He loved the chaos they brought. Irene bit her lip as if worried. What will they think of you showing up with a wife and kids you want them to just accept? Ken laughed, shaking his head. They'll take it in stride. My mother and grandmother were both mail-order brides. Trust me, my family won't think it's strange at all for me to come home with a wife and 2 kids. They'll just welcome you with open arms. He paused for a moment, looking at her. What will your parents think? She shrugged. They'll think I'm doing the right thing. Her brows drew together. It's my in-laws I'm worried about. They'll think I'm being disrespectful to Richard's memory. They won't care if Richard wanted this or not. She shrugged, as if she didn't care, but he could see she really did. He reached across the table and took her hand in his. The good news is, if they don't approve, you'll be living in another state, and there's not a lot they can do about it. She smiled and nodded. That's true. And she wouldn't be alone any longer. Having someone help her protect the children seemed like a dream come true. After lunch, could we head straight to your preacher's house and get the marriage handled? Then maybe I can meet your parents, so they don't worry that I'll mistreat you and the kids. She looked worried. They're very strict Christians, and somehow feel that Richard failed me by not leaving me enough money to survive without him. Trust me. They won't worry. Ken shook his head. They don't understand he was doing what needed to be done? That he served his country? She shook her head. They didn't think he should enlist. If he'd been drafted, I'm sure they would feel differently, but they felt with him being married, having a son and another child on the way, his duty was to us, and not to his country. Her eyes met his. They'll think you did the right thing, because you were single, but they just couldn't agree with Richard's decision. Well, we'll go meet them after the wedding. Or do you want to have them there? I'd rather it just be us. It'll be hard enough explaining everything that happened afterward. He nodded, understanding. He wished she'd had the unconditional support he'd always felt growing up, but he understood why she felt the way she did. We'll do it that way then. After their meal, they all walked to her pastor's house. On the way she explained, I go to a different church than my parents. When we married, I joined Richard's church. My church growing up was very strict, and in my opinion, too judgmental. So many people don't realize that Christians can see things in different ways, and what's wrong for one, isn't necessarily wrong for another. She paused and looked over at him. They were walking with the children between them. The new church is a lot better about things like that. My town is small enough that there's only one church, but I've never found the people to be overly judgmental. Of course, half the congregation is my family. She shook her head. The more you talk about your family, the more intimidated I feel. That's a lot of people for me to meet and get along with. Don't feel intimidated by my family, he told her. They'll welcome you with no problem. You'll have a house full of family whenever you want, but when you don't want them there, they'll leave. You'll see. It'll be good. She looked skeptical as she turned to walk up to the front of a house. This is where Pastor Sheldon lives. Chapter 4. The house was small, but painted a pretty shade of blue. While she knocked, Ken looked down at the children. They'd been perfectly behaved during the walk to the pastor's house, both of them holding the hands of the adults. Ronald had kept sneaking glances at him, as if to try to take his measure, but Ken had understood the need. The door opened and a young man, no more than 18, opened the door. Is your father home? The youth nodded, giving Ken a wary look before running off to get his father. A man around Ken's father's age opened the door. Irene, how can I help you today? His gaze took in Ken as well, and the look on his face was curious. Irene indicated Ken, obviously searching for the right way to explain the situation. This is Ken Stevens. He was Richard's wingman during the war. We'd like to get married today. The pastor looked back and forth between the two of them for a moment, before nodding and inviting them all inside. Are you a Christian? He asked Ken. Ken looked around the small comfortable living area. It held 2 rocking chairs and a couch. It was obviously used often by the family who lived there. On a small table between the 2 wooden rocking chairs was a Bible and a pile of papers with a pen on top. Ken nodded. Yes, sir. Richard and I were the only Christians in our squad and became extremely close friends as a result. I see. Did Richard ask you to check in on Irene? Yes, sir. He left a letter in my care to take to Irene in the event of his death. He also asked that I take care of his family if anything happened to him. He didn't add that Richard had asked him to promise to care for his family before every mission. A look of understanding dawned on the preacher's face. Well, there's not a better way to take care of them. He picked up his Bible from the table between the rockers. He looked down at Ronald. Are you ready for this man to be your new father? Ronald looked at Ken for a moment, and then nodded to the pastor. Yes, sir. A brief smile crossed Pastor Sheldon's face. He turned his attention to Carol, who had barely spoken in Ken's presence. Do you want this man to be your new daddy, Carol? Carol put her hand into Ken's, touching him for the first time. Daddy, was all she said, but it was enough. Pastor Sheldon turned his attention to the two adults before him. Do you mind if I change the wording on the vows a little? Ken looked startled but shook his head. I guess not. Why does he want to change the wording on the vows? Aren't the traditional vows good enough? Irene shook her head. No, sir. Let me get my wife and son in here to be your witnesses, and then we'll go ahead and get started. He hurried from the room and came back with his wife and the boy who had answered the door. His wife was a plump woman in her mid-40s. She had dark hair with streaks of gray and pretty brown eyes. She shot Irene a concerned look as she rushed to her side. Irene smiled and shook her head, silently asking the woman not to ask any questions. We're gathered here today to join this man and this woman along with these two children, into a family. Do you, Ken, take Irene to be your lawfully married wife? To love, honor, and cherish her as long as you both shall live? Ken swallowed the lump in his throat. I do. Do you also take these two precious children as your own, and promise to love, teach and cherish them for as long as they are under your care? Ken smiled slightly. Now he understood the changes in wording. I absolutely do. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Irene's lips quirk up into a slight smile. Do you, Irene McGregor, take Ken to be your lawfully wedded husband? To love, honor, and obey him for as long as you both shall live? Ken stood listening to silence for what seemed like an hour. Was she going to back out? Finally, he heard Irene whisper, I do. Pastor Sheldon smiled. By the power vested in me by God and the state of Michigan, I now pronounce you a family. He looked at Ken. You may kiss your bride and hug your children. Ken hadn't thought about the kiss. He'd never kissed a woman in his life. He looked at Irene skeptically for a moment, before lowering his head and quickly brushing his lips across hers. Not looking at his new bride, he turned to the children and opened his arms. They both rushed him, hugging him, and Irene hugged him as well. His eyes finally met Irene's. I guess we're a family now. He turned to the pastor and slipped a bill into his hand. Thank you, sir. Pastor Sheldon nodded. She's a good woman. You're doing something good here. I know she is, sir. Richard never stopped talking about her. Mrs. Sheldon stepped forward then. Would you like to stay for coffee? I've made some fresh cookies. Irene shook her head, answering for them. I really appreciate the offer, Mrs. Sheldon, but I need to go talk to my parents. They're expecting me to move in with them tomorrow, and now that won't be happening. Mrs. Sheldon looked at Ken. Where will you all be living? I have a house in Hudspeth, Minnesota. My family has lived there for several generations. The children will have cousins to play with, and my family will be thrilled to welcome new family members. Mrs. Sheldon's face softened. That sounds lovely. She turned to Irene. You make sure you write to us, and let us know that you're okay. Irene smiled. I will. She hugged the older woman tightly. We'll be fine. When they left, Irene turned left, but they'd come from the right. My parents' house is only a few blocks this way. Let's just get it over with. The look on her face told Ken she truly dreaded facing her parents. The children once again walked between them. Ken held onto Carol's hand while Irene held Ronald's. They walked in silence the entire distance. Ken wasn't sure what you said to a wife who was virtually a stranger or either of your two new children. He wasn't looking forward to meeting her parents after the way she'd spoken about them, but he knew she needed him there to help her. They turned 2 corners, and finally she stopped in front of a house painted stark white. The lawn was perfectly manicured, with 2 small flower beds in the front. Even the flowers seemed to be organized into ruler straight rows. He thought of his Aunt Allison's flower beds, which were always a jumble of color. He'd once asked her how she made them so colorful, and she'd laughed as she'd made her confession. "I pick seeds from all over the store. A little bit of everything. And then I put them into a bowl and shake them up. When it's time to plant, I just throw them everywhere." He grinned at the memory. He'd see her flower beds in just a day or two. Irene glanced over at him as if she needed him to give her courage before she knocked on the door. A young man answered, looking at her in surprise. "I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow." "I need to talk with Mother and Father, Tom." Tom nodded, giving Ken an unsure look, before opening the door wide for them. Ken followed Irene and the children into the house, noting how immaculate it was. He was struck then by the fact Irene had knocked. When he went to his parents', or his grandparents' houses, he just walked right in, calling out that he was there. Tom went out of the room, while Irene led him to the couch. The 2 of them sat together on the couch, while the children immediately sat on the floor. Ken looked at Irene with surprise. "Why are they sitting on the floor?" "There's room." He scooted away from her to make room in the middle of the couch. She leaned toward him and whispered, "My parents don't allow children to sit on the furniture in the living room. Only on their beds and on the chairs in the kitchen." "Why?" He'd never heard of such a thing. He'd been raised to think of children as wonderful gifts sent from God, not as second-class citizens. She shrugged. "That's how it's always been in our house." Ken looked up as Tom returned with an elderly man and woman. They looked like they were at least 70, with pinched-up faces and scowls. "Why are you here early, Irene? We weren't expecting you until tomorrow? And what are you doing running around town with another soldier when your husband just died? What will people say?" The woman was the first to speak, standing over them with her arms crossed over her chest, glaring down at them. She wore an old black dress that looked as if it had seen better days. "Mother, Father, this is Ken Stevens. He was Richard's wingman during the war." "Well, you certainly didn't do your job right, did you?" Irene's father asked. Ken stared at the couple in disbelief. Richard had never mentioned his in-laws, and he knew why now. "I did my best, sir. There was so much black smoke, I couldn't even see my wing." His head was again filled with images of the black smoke. He could see the empty spot to his right where Richard's plane should have been. Irene shook her head sadly. "I married Ken this afternoon. We're going to go live with him in Minnesota." "Well, that's good. We didn't want to have to take on 3 more mouths to feed anyway." "When are you leaving?" Irene's mother asked. Neither her mother nor father had bothered to sit down to talk with them. Ken stood up. "We'll leave in the morning. God bless you." He took Irene and Carol by the hands and headed for the door. He was done with them. Why wouldn't they show just a bit of affection for their daughter and grandchildren? He dropped Carol's hand to open the door, and walked straight out without another word. He glanced back over his shoulder to be sure Ronald was following behind them. After they were outside, he turned to close the front door behind them and walked in the direction they'd come from. It was a full minute before Irene spoke. "Where are we going?" Ken stopped and looked at her. "Back to your house. We're going in the wrong direction." "We need to go that way," she said, pointing to the left. "Fine." He started walking in the direction she'd pointed, still too angry to speak. "Are you upset with me?" Irene finally asked. He stopped walking and looked at her over the heads of the 2 children. "Of course not. I just can't believe how cold your parents were. They didn't care where I took you as long as they didn't have to lift a finger to help you in any way." She shrugged. "They've always been like that. They do their duty, but no more. They're happy to be rid of us, I'm sure. Are Richard's parents the same way?" She shook her head. "Richard was their only child. They practically worshipped him and the kids. They don't much care for me, but they love the kids. Well, they love them now that Richard isn't around for them to dote on. She spoke only of her mother-in-law. She'd never had a real conversation with her father-in-law and had no idea how he felt about it. Do we need to tell them? No. She looked almost afraid of the idea. I mean, I'll write to them when we get to Minnesota and let them know we're okay. Okay. He gave her a questioning look, but when she said nothing more, he started walking again. What now? Should we spend the night apart? Or should I stay at your house? Or you guys stay in the hotel with me? He wished he'd thought this part of things through. I need to spend some time figuring out how to get things shipped. All of our furniture has been sold, and someone will pick it up in the morning. That was already planned. I mean our personal things. He nodded. Is there a lot? She thought about it. Not a whole lot more than clothes. Can we just take them on the train? We're each allowed 2 suitcases. He would happily ship the things she needed shipped, but if he could save the money, he'd rather do that. He wasn't a rich man and preferred to be frugal when possible. I think we could. Well, I do have dishes and a few personal things like that. Irene bit her lip considering. We'll ship everything but the clothes. It's not a big deal. He lapsed into silence again. He was sure eventually they'd find things to talk about, but right now the only thing they had in common was Richard, and his memory was still too fresh for either of them to talk about him comfortably. When they got to her house, they all went inside and he looked over the 4 boxes that needed to be shipped. Do the dishes have sentimental value? She shook her head. I bought them second-hand. They really don't mean anything to me. Well, how would you feel about selling them, then? I have dishes. I have everything we need except clothes. If we sell off anything that's not sentimental, then we won't have to mess with shipping them. Or we could give them away. I don't really care. She looked at him for a moment thinking about it. The people coming tomorrow to get the furniture are helping a family who is new to the area. I think they'd be thrilled to give them the dishes as well. I was only keeping them because I could find space to store them. If you have dishes, then I don't need them. Would you mind doing that? She shook her head. Not at all. She looked through the boxes they'd packed and put one aside. This is the only one with sentimental things. I'll see if I can spread the things out between our suitcases for the train. If not, we'll ship them. I was raised not to waste money, and to me, shipping a bunch of things we don't need is a waste. If it's something we need or even just something you'll use, I'll be happy to ship it. That sounds good. She looked around at the mess her house was in. I can't fix anything for dinner. I feel funny asking you to go back to the hotel, but the truth is, you'll be a lot more comfortable there. Do you all want to go with me? I have 2 beds in my room. Ronald could sleep with me, and you could sleep with Carol. What time are the men coming to pick up your furniture in the morning? 7. What time is our train? I checked the schedule on the way here this morning. We can leave at 10. We'll have to change trains in Chicago before going on to St. Paul. How far is Hudspeth from St. Paul? I'm not sure. I've only gone there by horse and buggy, but my Uncle Frank is going to borrow an automobile, and he's picking us up. I'll have to use the hotel telephone tonight to let him know it will be 4 instead of 1. She bit her lip. Will he mind? Uncle Frank? He'll tell us to pile in. He loves kids. Okay. When should we get to St. Paul? If we're on that train at 10 tomorrow morning, we should be to St. Paul by noon on Saturday. It'll be a long day, but we can handle it. She nodded, looking at the children. I hope the excitement of being on a train will help them get over their boredom. The kids are well behaved. We'll talk to them and keep them occupied. It'll be fine. Okay, we'll stay in the hotel for the night. I do think the children will be more comfortable that way. He nodded. We can go to the restaurant for dinner as well. I think we'll all prefer that. He waited as she spread her box of sentimental things amongst 4 suitcases and got them all packed. He looked at them. Is that all? She nodded slowly, almost embarrassed that she had so little to take into their marriage. Let's get the suitcases to the hotel tonight. It's right next to the train station, and since I don't have to be out of my room until 10, it'll be easier to get them to the train station from the hotel. She nodded, picking up the lightest suitcases. He looked from her to the suitcases. Let's do this. You stay here with the kids while I walk the first 2 over, and I'll come back for you and the kids and carry the other 2. I don't want you to have to carry them all the way to the hotel. How far is it? She asked. It's a 20-minute walk, so not terribly far, but too far for you to be carrying suitcases. He took the 2 suitcases from her and opened the door. I'll be back soon. She nodded, sitting down on the couch with the children. Be careful. Chapter 5. Ken sat across from Irene on the train, telling her about his large family. I have 3 sisters and a brother. My sister, Helen, is 2 years younger than me. Ruby and Esther are 4 years younger, and George is 6 years younger. And they all live in the area? George is still living at home and helping Papa with the farm. Papa's a dairy farmer. Helen got married right after I left for the war. She has a 2-year-old daughter named Nancy, but I haven't met her yet. Ruby and Esther had a double wedding last year. They both married farmers who live in the area. Irene shook her head. I'll never remember all the names. You have extended family in the area as well, right? Ken nodded. My grandparents live about a mile from my parents. I have aunts, uncles, and cousins scattered all around. She sighed. I hope they like me. Of course, they'll like you. My family likes everyone. He looked out the window, knowing they'd be stopping in St. Paul any minute. I told Uncle Frank to not tell anyone we were coming. I want to surprise my mama and papa. He turned his eyes to hers, excitement dancing in them. I haven't seen them for almost 4 years. Mama's going to go nuts. She smiled at the picture he painted with his words. Your family sounds amazing. Are they all Christians? He nodded. Everyone last one of us. Life is a lot slower where we live. My dad wanted me to be a farmer like him, but I liked the idea of having a real day off every week. He has to milk the cows 7 days a week, rain or shine. I have every Sunday off. She looked at him, just then realizing she didn't know what he did for a living. What do you do? He laughed softly. I guess that's something a wife should know, isn't it? I work for the cheese factory my papa has been selling his milk to my entire life. Do you enjoy your job? He shrugged. I do. I like it better than farming. They promised to hold my job for me when I left for the war. A lot of the women in the area had to work in the factory while we were gone, but I'm sure they'll be happy to go back home and keep house again. She looked at him for a moment, considering. If I decided I wanted to go to work, would you let me? She had no desire to do anything but keep house and raise her family, but she knew a lot of women felt differently and wondered how he felt about the idea of his wife working for a living. Ken thought about that for a minute. The only thing he'd ever known was the women in the family staying home and taking care of the kids while the men worked. It wouldn't bother me, I don't think. Once the kids are in school, that is. I think they need to have a mama at home with them. He looked at her. Are you thinking about getting a job? She shook her head. No, I want to be home for the children. I was just wondering how it would make you feel. I don't think women are any less capable than men. I do think some jobs are more suited to men than to women, but if you decide you want to work, I won't complain. Too much. He grinned to let her know he was joking. I really don't want a job. I think a wife's place is in the home. I like the idea of having cookies made for the children when they come home from school. A lot of my friends' moms did that for them, but not yours? He hadn't brought up her parents and the way they treated her since the day they'd married. He had a lot of questions, though, because what he'd seen there had been completely foreign to him. She shook her head slowly. My mother didn't believe children should have sweets. She had some very strange ideas. I do my best to learn from her example and treat my children the way I wish she'd treated me. The train started slowing then, and he realized they were in St. Paul. He gave her a bolstering smile, realizing she was desperately afraid of meeting his family. This is our stop. Welcome to Minnesota. She took a deep breath and reached over to wake Carol, who'd fallen asleep. We're here. Are you ready to go for a ride in an automobile? Carol's eyes grew wide. Auto? Irene smiled and nodded. That's right. Are you excited? Ronald bounced in his seat. Like the one Mr. and Mrs. James have? The one they take us to church in when it's raining? I'm not sure if it'll be just like that, but it'll be an automobile. Wow. Carol grinned over at Ken. Ken smiled, glad to excite the children. He picked Carol up and left Irene to hold Ronald's hand. Once they were all on the train platform, he stood looking around for Uncle Frank. After a moment, he spotted the tall, dark-haired man. He waved and Frank spotted them, moving through the crowd toward them. He hugged Ken, careful not to squash Carol. Uncle Frank, this is my wife, Irene, and our children, Ronald and Carol. Frank grinned and held out his hand for Irene. Nice to meet you, Irene. He knelt down in front of Ronald. I'm going to be your favorite uncle, okay? Ronald just looked at him for a moment. I get to pick my favorite. Ken laughed. Let him pick his own favorite, Uncle Frank. Irene watched Ken with his uncle, with a smile on her face. He'd seemed so reserved while they were in Michigan, and now that he was home, she expected to see a different man. Irene held the hands of both of the children while the two men carried the suitcases. It was a good thing Ken had only brought one, because they wouldn't have been able to manage otherwise. Irene had been there when Ken phoned Frank, so she knew he hadn't explained anything about her, but Frank asked no questions, and seemed to accept her and the children without hesitation. Once they reached the automobile, she sat in the back with the two children, even after Ken offered her the front seat. She knew the two men would have a lot to catch up on, and it would be nice to be able to observe her new husband without him noticing. The automobile was a 1941 Dodge luxury liner, and she found the back seat extremely comfortable, even though she was sharing it with the two children. How long will the drive to Hudspeth take in this, Uncle Frank? Ken asked from the front seat. Frank shot Ken a grin of pure joy. Less than an hour once we're out of the city. City traffic is slower, so it'll be 10 minutes before we're out of the city, and then we're just going to fly. I don't know if I'll be willing to call it flying. Frank laughed softly and glanced at Ken. No, not after your experience in the war. Does Mama know we're coming? I didn't say a word to her. I thought she'd be excited to see your face. Frank grew serious for a minute. I'm sorry about what happened to your friend. Your papa told us. Ken nodded sadly. Irene was his wife. I thought that might be the case. Irene blocked out their voices after that. In her sorrow, she kept forgetting just how much Ken was also affected by Richard's death. Once they hit the open road, Irene enjoyed the drive more. The windows were open, and she loved the feel of the wind rushing through her hair as they made the drive. Carol sat leaning against her and she pointed out different things as they drove past them. Irene had been in automobiles many times, but this was the first time she'd gone for a drive of any length. It was usually just to church and home again. Her father had never owned an auto, and she and Richard had been unable to afford one. They'd promised themselves they'd find a way after the war. Frank pulled up in front of a large farmhouse. Irene looked around her, knowing this must be Ken's parents' house. She got out, and pulled Carol out, picking her up, holding her almost as a shield. Richard's mother had considered her beneath him, and had told her often she wasn't good enough for Richard. She said a silent prayer that her new mother-in-law would be easier to get along with. At the sound of the automobile, the door opened and a pretty blonde woman stood with her hand over her mouth, staring at Ken. He removed his dress cap, and stood looking at her across the yard. After a moment, he walked around the car, and plucked her off her front step, picking her up and spinning her in a circle. The woman clutched Ken to her. After a moment, Ken pulled away and she saw the woman had tears streaming down her face. Ken took her hand and led her to where Irene stood with the children on the far side of the car. "Mama, this is my wife, Irene, and our children, Ronald and Carol." Up close, Irene could see slight lines on the woman's face, and guessed she was in her early 40s. Irene held Carol in her left hand and held out her right to shake her new mother-in-law's. Ken's mother ignored the hand and pulled Irene into a tight embrace. "We don't shake hands in this family. We hug." She turned to Carol. "Well, hello there, Carol. I'm your grandma. Do you want to come see me?" She held her hands out to the girl, but Carol buried her face in Irene's shoulder. "I'm sorry. She's shy around strangers, Mrs. Stevens." "That's okay. And call me Maggie or Mama if you feel comfortable." She took Ronald's hand and led them into the house. "Are you just coming into town?" she asked Ken. "Uncle Frank picked us up from the train station. I wanted to surprise you, so I told him not to tell you I was coming." "I wish I'd known. I'd have cleaned your house and had a nice meal waiting for you." Maggie looked at Irene. "I've cleaned it once a month and kept the dust from getting too thick, but it needs a good airing out." She led Ronald to the table and took some cookies off the counter. She placed 3 on a plate in front of him and looked at Carol. "Do you want some cookies, too? Grandma made them just this morning." Carol nodded, so Maggie took another plate down and put 3 more cookies on it. Then she got 2 glasses and filled them halfway up with milk. She looked between Irene and Ken. "Coffee?" Ken shook his head. "I want milk and cookies." He sat down and waited as his mother got him a plate. "I think I missed your cooking almost more than anything else." Maggie nodded. "You say that, but when your grandmother cooks something, you'll say the same thing to her." Ken shrugged, looking like a boy. "Can I help it my mama and grandma are the best cooks in the whole state of Minnesota?" Maggie turned to Irene. "Coffee? Milk? Cookies?" Irene smiled. "I haven't had milk and cookies in a long time." "That sounds good." She wasn't sure if she should help or just sit down as Ken had. "Can I help with anything? You just got off a train. Sit down, and I'll get you milk and cookies. I'll let you help the next time you come over." Maggie turned to Frank. "Go get Daniel. I think he's out mending fences in the north pasture today. He's going to be upset with me if he doesn't get to see Ken today." Frank hurried out the door. Ken winked at Irene. "Mama can boss Uncle Frank around because he's her double brother-in-law." Irene blinked a couple of times trying to understand that. "What's a double brother-in-law?" "He's Daniel's brother, and he married my sister." Maggie sat down with her own plate of cookies and glass of milk. "Daniel is Ken's father." "I see. So their kids would be double cousins of Ken's as well." Maggie nodded with a smile. "That's what we call them. It's silly, I know, but we like to laugh around here." She looked between Ken and Irene. "So how did the 2 of you meet?" "Irene is Richard's widow." A look of understanding crossed Maggie's face and she reached across the table and took Irene's hand in hers. "I lost my fiancé to the First World War." Ken looked at his mother in shock. "I didn't know you were engaged before Papa." "I don't think about him much anymore." She shrugged. "Time does eventually heal your wounds." She took a bite of her cookie. "So when did you 2 meet?" Ken smiled. "Thursday." Maggie laughed softly. "No time to waste." Her face turned serious. "I'm glad you married her, Ken. If you need any help settling in, I'm here. I'd love to get to know my new grandbabies." Irene wasn't sure how to respond to that. Richard's mother had been kind and helpful as long as Richard was in the room, but as soon as he left them alone, she turned into a nightmare-inducing crone. She couldn't judge her new mother-in-law by her old one, though. This one could be wonderful for all she knew. Ken certainly thought she would be. Irene nodded slowly. "That would be nice. I'm sure we'll all be busy with church tomorrow, and then we have a big family dinner planned at my mother-in-law's. But I'd like to come over Monday morning. We can help you get everything organized like you want it, and if you need anything, we can figure out what needs to be done. I'll think about it. Maggie turned to Ken. Do you start back to work on Monday? Ken shrugged. I need to go see Mr. Zimmerman at the cheese factory this afternoon to find out if he wants me back right away. I would think so, but I'll let you know tomorrow morning at church. The door opened and an older man, who looked very much like Ken with darker hair, strode into the house. He obviously hadn't been told Ken was home, because he stood for a moment staring in shock, his eyes suspiciously wet. He walked around the table and Ken stood up, turning immediately into the man's arms. It's so good to have you home, son. The words were simple, but the wealth of emotion behind them had tears in Irene's eyes. She understood what Ken had told her about his family then. They truly were a tight-knit loving clan. It's good to be home, Papa. The two men clutched one another in a way Irene had never seen with other men. Richard's father would have shaken his hand when he got home from the war, but Ken and his father didn't appear ashamed of the embrace they shared. After a long moment, Maggie cleared her throat. Daniel? Ken brought home his new wife and 2 grandchildren for us. Daniel pulled away. It had been obvious that as soon as he'd seen Ken, he'd noticed no one else in the room. Grandkids? Ken put his hand on Irene's shoulder. This is my wife, Irene. Daniel smiled and nodded. Welcome to the family. Irene blinked a couple of times to clear her eyes of the tears that had formed while she'd watched father and son. Thank you. Daniel turned his attention to the children seated at the table. And who do we have here? Maggie had coaxed Carol into her lap and was sitting beside Ronald. She nodded to Carol and said, This is our new granddaughter, Carol, and our grandson, Ronald. Daniel's face split into a huge grin. Have either of you ever milked a cow? Ronald shook his head. No, sir. Well, real soon, we'll have to have you come out here and spend the night. You can help me do the chores and milk the cows. Ronald's eyes widened as he looked at his mother. May I? Irene smiled at her son. Soon. He'd never spent the night with either set of grandparents before, because they hadn't been interested. Well, Richard's parents had suddenly become interested after Richard died, but before his death, they'd showed little attention to the children. Neither of the children had ever spent a night away from her, so the idea was one she'd have to get used to. Ken's father seemed to take her answer in stride. The door opened again, and Frank came in with a young man with dark hair. George? She wondered. The young man took one look at Ken and let out a whoop, running across the room and hugging Ken. How many Nazis did you kill, Ken? Mama said I couldn't go until I was 21, and the war ended too soon for me to help. Ken shook his head at his younger brother. Killing a man, whether he's a Nazi or not, is never something to brag about, George. Ken's eyes were sad as he spoke. Irene hadn't realized he was feeling badly over the lives he'd had to take during the war. George looked down at the floor, obviously embarrassed. Sorry, Ken. Hey, I heard about your buddy. That's rough. Ken nodded, accepting the show of remorse for what it was. Hey, you need to meet my family. This is my wife, Irene, and our kids, Ronald and Carol. George's eyes widened as they turned to Irene. Irene smiled slightly, embarrassed to be under such scrutiny. It's nice to meet you. Walking over behind his mother, George ruffled Carol's hair. So you must be Ronald, right? Carol shook her head, giggling. Carol. Well, it's nice to meet you, Carol. I'm Uncle George. Carol stared at him, feeling safe in Maggie's arms. She watched warily as he went to Ronald and shook his hand gravely. I'd like to be the first to welcome you to the family. Ronald stared up at the tall dark-haired man. Hi. Hi. George was grinning from ear to ear. We really need to be going. I have to talk to the factory manager yet today. Ken looked at his father. Are my horses in the stable? Daniel nodded. I'll help you hitch them. After they'd left, Maggie looked at Irene. I'm really sorry I didn't get over to your house to clean before today. If I'd known you were coming, I'd have had it all ready for you. Frank stepped forward. Don't worry, Maggie. Allison's been there all day cleaning it. I had to tell her Ken was coming so she'd know where I was going, so she said it was her homecoming present for him. Maggie looked relieved. Oh, good. She looked back at Irene. Allison is my sister and Frank's wife. Irene's eyes widened with surprise. She didn't have to clean the house for me. I could have done it when we got there. Maggie shook her head. It's been empty for several years. It needed to be aired out. Ken opened the door and called to Irene. Are you ready to go home? Irene stood up. Thank you for the cookies and milk. She reached out her hands to take Carol from Maggie. The little girl looked like she was about to fall asleep, so she carried her toward the door. Come along, Ronald. Ronald's lip poofed out. I want to stay and help milk the cows. Irene shook her head. The invitation wasn't for tonight. We'll do it soon. Maggie hugged her new grandson. We'll make it very soon. She took Ronald's hand and led him outside toward the buggy waiting in front of the house. After the children were seated in the back, Maggie hugged Irene again. We'll see you tomorrow morning at church. Welcome to the family. Irene smiled, hoping her new mother-in-law would act just the same when they were alone together. Thank you. She accepted Ken's hand for help as she climbed into the buggy. It was nice meeting you. As they pulled away, she turned to Ken. Your family is very welcoming. Ken nodded. I told you my family would be thrilled to meet you. She turned to the back of the buggy to make sure the children were doing well, but they were both staring at the scenery around them with awe. How long will it be before we get to your house? He grinned at her. Our house is about 45 minutes from here. I'll have enough time to show you around, but then I need to go talk to my old boss and get my job back. Most of the drive was spent in silence, except for Ken pointing out where various family members lived along the way. Once they were in town, he pointed out the A&P. It's the town's only supermarket, so you need to get used to shopping there. He drove past the church and pointed out Aunt Faith's house. She's Papa's twin sister. After a couple of turns, he pulled up in front of a small white house. There was a small building behind the house that she assumed he used for his horses. He helped her down from the buggy and led her up to the house with his hand at her elbow. He opened the door and was immediately pulled into a fierce hug by a woman who looked to be in her early 40s with red hair pulled back into a bun. Aunt Allison. I didn't know you'd be here. Frank didn't tell you? That's odd. Irene watched them for a moment before saying, I knew. Allison pulled away from Ken and looked at her. I'm Ken's Aunt Allison. Irene smiled, noting the woman looked nothing like her sister. I'm Ken's wife, Irene, and these are my children, Ronald and Carol. Allison smiled down at the children. Well, come on in, and I'll get out of your way. I need to get home and start supper anyway. She left waving goodbye as she reached the street. Irene looked at Ken in surprise. Where does she live? Near my parents, but she's probably meeting Frank at Aunt Faith's when he returns the car. Oh. I was worried she was going to walk a long distance after cleaning all day. Ken smiled, ushering her and the children inside. I wouldn't let my aunt walk that far. I'd have offered her a ride if she'd needed it. Irene looked down, embarrassed that she'd even questioned him. I know. I shouldn't have said anything. Don't worry about it. You've only known me for a few days. He looked around his house with a smile. It's a lot cleaner than when I left. They were in the living room, which was small, but clean. He took her to the kitchen, which was a decent-sized room. It was painted a light green. They updated my kitchen while I was gone. He walked to the stove, which was a new white gas stove. There was a refrigerator in one corner. I didn't cook enough to even bother with a refrigerator, and I was still using an old wood-burning stove. Irene felt the smile spread across her face. I'm going to love cooking here. I'm glad. They stood for another minute admiring the kitchen before he took her down the hall to show her the 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. All 3 bedrooms had the beds made up. This one is mine, he told her. I thought you and Carol could share this one for now. He opened another door to a room with a bed that was certainly big enough for 2 people. She smiled and nodded. The furniture looked old, as if he'd been given the cast-offs of his relatives, and he probably had. "This will be perfect for us." "Thank you." He showed them the last bedroom, which had a smaller bed in it. "What do you think of your room, Ronald?" Ronald grinned. "My very own room. I don't have to share with Carol?" Irene rubbed his head. "I'm going to share with Carol for now." Ronald ran into the room with a smile and sat down on the bed, bouncing slightly. "I like it." Ken sat down on Ronald's bed beside him. "I need to go and talk to my boss for a while. Can you take care of your mom and sister for me while I'm gone?" Ronald looked confused. "But my mama takes care of me." Ken laughed and hugged the boy. "She does a good job of it, doesn't she?" He stood up and walked toward Irene. "I'll carry your suitcases in, and then I need to go." "You make yourself at home. Rearrange furniture or whatever." "I don't mind." He reached into his pocket and pulled out some cash. "You'll need to go to the A&P if you want to cook anything for dinner. Sandwiches are fine, because I know you must be as tired as I am." He searched Irene's eyes. "Do you need anything else before I go?" She shook her head, her hand going to his and squeezing it. "Not a thing. Thank you for making this so easy for us." He shook his head. "Asking you to move 2 states away is making things easy? I think you're just an easy woman to please." She watched as he disappeared out the front door to bring the suitcases in. Chapter 6. Ken walked through the quiet streets of Hudspeth, breathing deeply of the air. Nowhere he'd been while in the Air Corps had smelled quite the same. Nothing had seemed right when he was gone. Hudspeth was home and he was thrilled to be there. He walked into the factory, through the employee door, and every head turned toward him. Most of the workers were still the women who'd taken over when the men had left. Ken scanned the room, trying to ignore the stares, looking for Mr. Zimmerman, his old boss. Finally, he saw him sitting at his desk, talking on the telephone. Ken walked to the office door and stood waiting for Mr. Zimmerman to finish his call. He could still feel the stares of the women working in the factory, and wished they'd go back to their work. He felt awkward enough. He wished he'd thought to change into his civilian clothes, but he'd been in the Air Corps for so long, the uniform felt natural. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Mr. Zimmerman hung up the phone and stepped through his office door. He had a huge smile on his face when he held his hand out for Ken to shake. "Welcome home. You ready to have your old job back?" Ken nodded. "Yes, sir." "Can you start Monday morning?" "I can." "Ate like before?" Ken was surprised it was so easy, even though he'd been promised it would be. "That would be great. I'm glad you're home safe and sound." Ken turned toward the door. "Thanks for keeping my job for me." "Anything for an airman." "I'll see you Monday morning." Ken walked out of the factory quickly, fully aware the women working at the different vats were still watching him closely. He didn't want to be under their scrutiny, and he didn't want anyone praising him for the work he'd done in the military. He just wanted to be alone for a while. He took the long way home, wandering the streets of Hudspeth, searching for things that were different. He walked past the small hardware store run by a friend of his father's, and down the street past the church. Once he reached the church, he walked to it, opening the door to see if it was empty. Pastor Johnson was at the front practicing his sermon. Ken started to leave, but the pastor called out to him. "Ken. It's good to have you home." Pastor Johnson was a short, portly man who had been the pastor for as long as Ken could remember. "Pastor Johnson. It's good to be home." Ken forced a smile as he walked to the pulpit and shook the older man's hand. "I'm glad you made it safe and sound." The pastor paused for a moment, before saying, "I heard about your friend. I'm very sorry for your loss." Ken felt the tears prick his eyes. "I still feel like it's my fault. He was my wingman. It was my job to keep him safe." The pastor walked to the front pew and sat down, patting the seat beside him. After Ken sat, Pastor Johnson said, "Tell me exactly what happened." Ken took a deep breath. Richard and I were friends from the moment we met. We were the only two Christians in our basic training group and we formed a bond. Once we went overseas, we were assigned to one another as wingmen. I'd watch out for him and he'd watch out for me. He stared at the cross on the wall, before continuing. Every time we went up, he made me promise him I'd take care of his wife and children if anything happened to him. On our last mission of the war, we were going to try to take out Hitler's mountain retreat and a very important train yard in Austria. Before we left, Richard and I prayed together like we always did, and he made me promise again that I'd take care of his family. Ken brushed away a tear that landed on his cheek, embarrassed for the pastor to see it. And? It was a 4-hour flight to our target, but the actually bombing just took a few minutes. There were no planes coming after us, so for a minute, we thought we were home free, and then they started the anti-aircraft. I'd never seen anything like it. The air was so thick, a black smoke covered everything. I couldn't even see my own wing, let alone Richard. He choked for a moment, unable to speak. When the air was clear again, he was gone. He'd just disappeared. I let the squadron leader know, but we couldn't look for him. It would have put us all in danger. I asked if I could stay behind and look alone, but I knew what the answer would be before I even asked. Ken looked down at his hands, which were holding his cap. When we got back to base, it was my job to clean out his locker. I found a letter addressed to me, saying he was holding me to my promise. There was a letter he wanted me to deliver to his wife, which I did. 2 days ago. She doesn't hold you responsible, does she? Ken shook his head. No, but her parents do. He sighed. I married her. I didn't know how else to take care of her. So now I'm married to a total stranger, and have 2 kids I barely know. And I feel guilty I couldn't come up with a better solution, but what could I do? I don't make enough money to support 2 households. Pastor Johnson sat for a moment in silence. I think you did the right thing. You didn't marry her because you were disrespecting your friend's wishes. You did it because you made a promise. God understands that, and so does your friend. Ken shook his head. I shouldn't have let him die. It should have been me. Ken, I know you, and I know the man you've become. Do you really think anything happened that wasn't part of God's plan? Ken shook his head. For some reason, your friend was meant to die that day. I have no idea what the reason could possibly be, but there's a reason. You did what you promised to do, and you're taking care of his widow and children. He patted Ken on the shoulder. Would you like me to pray with you? Ken nodded, taking comfort in the pastor's words. He hadn't known Richard, but they both knew God, and that helped. After the prayer, Ken got to his feet. I left them alone at the house. I had to talk to my old boss and get my job back, but I needed to be alone for a while too. He shook hands with the pastor. Thanks for talking to me today. I needed it. Anytime. If I'm not here, come to my house and talk to me. You're always welcome. Thank you. Ken headed for the door. I'll see you in the morning. As Ken made the short walk home from the church, his mind was still reeling. He was glad the pastor agreed with his decision, but he wished he felt more comfortable about it himself. When the house was in sight, Ken stopped and looked at it for a moment. Inside that house were his wife and 2 children. He was going to be the best husband and father he could possibly be. Guilt or no guilt, he'd done what he'd promised to do, and he would continue. While Ken was gone, Irene took advantage of the time, unpacking for herself and the children. She put her things in the room Carol would use, wondering how long she'd be sleeping apart from Ken. She certainly wasn't ready to begin an intimate relationship with him so soon after Richard's death, and she was grateful for his understanding. Once she had their things unpacked and the children's beds made up, they walked the short distance to the supermarket. She bought the things she'd need for a couple days' worth of meals, but decided she'd save a big trip for when she had the horse and buggy. She'd always walked around Detroit or taken the street railway, so she was unused to driving a team, and hoped she could get Ken to teach her soon. The children walked along beside her, obviously thinking of their new life as a great adventure. She was thrilled they were so resilient and had no memories of Richard to make them sad as they started looking to Ken as a father. Once they were home, she started dinner, planning a meal of pork roast, mashed potatoes, gravy, biscuits, and green beans. She'd heard a lot already about what wonderful cooks his mother and grandmother were. She was half afraid to cook for him. What if he found her lacking? She kept looking at the clock as she cooked, wondering what was taking him so long. It shouldn't take more than an hour to walk to the factory and talk to his old boss, should it? Finally, just before dinner was ready, Ken walked in. "I'm sorry I was gone so long." She nodded, not feeling like she had the right to ask where he'd been. "It's fine. Dinner's almost ready, thanks." He stood there for a moment looking like he wanted to say something more, but shook his head. "I'm going to go and take a quick bath before dinner. I'll be down in a few minutes." Irene watched him go, wondering what was going through his mind. He seemed very bothered by something, and she wished she had an idea of what she could do to help him. She felt like their marriage was entirely one-sided, with him giving everything and her providing nothing. She turned back to the potatoes and finished mashing them. They'd figure it all out soon, she was sure. She said a quick prayer as she set the table, asking God to help her understand what she needed to do to make her marriage go smoothly. Ken could see the black smoke from the artillery shells all around him. His eyes swept the area, trying to spot Richard, but all he could see was the inside of his cockpit. He strained his eyes, using his hand to try to clear the smoke from his vision. His eyes hurt from the acrid smoke. When the smoke cleared, he realized his friend was gone. He searched the air and the ground for him. Where was he? Ken sat bolt upright in bed, Richard's name on his lips. He was panting and had a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. Closing his eyes tightly to block out the memory, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed. Milk. His mother had always encouraged him to drink warm milk when he couldn't sleep or he'd had a nightmare. He knew Irene had gotten milk at the supermarket, because he'd drunk some with his dinner. He descended the stairs in his pajama bottoms and white t-shirt. When he entered the kitchen, he saw Irene already sitting at the table in her nightgown, her hands wrapped around a mug. He walked to the stove and poured what was left in the pot into a mug and sat down across from her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not at all. I feel too guilty to sleep." Ken raised an eyebrow. "Why do you feel guilty?" She shrugged. "I feel like I should have waited longer before remarrying. I know you were Richard's friend, but I feel like I betrayed our vows somehow." Ken reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I've been feeling the same way, but I know it's what Richard wanted from me. Maybe we should have waited a few more months, but I couldn't let you move in with your parents when it was obvious you didn't want it, and it wouldn't be best for the children. I didn't know how else to help you." He took a sip of his milk, watching her over the top of the mug. "I know. That doesn't seem to stop the guilt, though." "For me either." She looked down into her mug. "Is that why you're up?" "I had a nightmare. I keep seeing the black smoke and realizing Richard's gone. I can't get past the fact that I should have been able to stop it somehow, or if not, then it should have been me. There was no one relying on me to come back home. My life wasn't as important as his." Her eyes widened as she looked at him. "Everyone is important in God's eyes." He let out a half laugh. "Sure, I know that. But it doesn't change how I feel. Why not just let me die and keep Richard alive for you and the kids?" She nodded slowly. "I understand how you're feeling. I'm sorry." She took another sip of her warm milk. "It's not your fault. I know, but I really understand. I want you to know how much I appreciate you taking care of the kids and me. I hope I can be the wife you need me to be." He shrugged. "For now, I just need a wife who will cook, clean, and take care of the kids." He ran his fingers through his sleep-tousled hair. "That's all I can handle right now." They finished their milk in companionable silence, each of them wishing they could do more for the other, but not knowing how. Chapter 7. Ken was frazzled by the time they left for church the following morning. He'd forgotten how hectic things were trying to get children ready on a Sunday morning. Irene tried to keep things calm, but Carol couldn't find the ribbons she wanted for her hair, and Ronald spilled milk all over himself and had to have another bath before they could go. "I'm so glad I didn't let them get dressed before breakfast," Irene said apologetically as she pushed the small boy into the bathroom. Ken kept looking at the clock, but it was getting later and later. He liked to leave at 9:15 for the 10 o'clock service, because he wanted to spend the 30 minutes before church fellowshipping. They finally made it out the door at 10:15. Irene was flushed, because she knew they were later than he wanted to be. "I'm sorry we're running late. It's hard to get out on time with children sometimes. I remember how crazy it was when I was a kid and there were 5 of us." "I don't blame you." He walked as quickly toward the church as the children would allow. "I would like us to get up a little earlier next Sunday and see if we can get out on time, though." She bit her lip, glad he hadn't come right out and said what he must be thinking. She had overslept and started breakfast 15 minutes later than planned, and after that everything had been downhill. "I'll do better next week. We were both up in the middle of the night. We're both tired. Don't let my grumpiness bother you." They arrived at the church just as everyone was finding their seats for the opening song and prayer. Maggie waved to them from the front of the church and indicated the pew beside her, where she'd saved them seats. Irene felt the tears stinging her eyes with embarrassment as she slipped in next to her mother-in-law. "I remember how hard it was getting everyone out of the house on time for church when mine were little." Irene quickly gave Maggie a one-armed hug. "Thank you. I needed to hear that this morning." Maggie laughed and held her hymnal out to share with Irene. "Ken hates being late. He's early for everything. You two will find a compromise." "I hope so." The music started then and they joined in the singing. Irene enjoyed singing, and was actually quite good at it. Singing at church had always been one of her favorite things to do. The sermon that day was on forgiveness. Pastor Johnson spoke about forgiving others as God forgives everyone, but added a new twist to the sermon that had never occurred to Irene. If God forgives you when you do something wrong, and you can't forgive yourself, what good does that do? Irene felt as if the pastor was speaking directly to her. How was it that God always gave her the right message at the right time? After church, she met several members of his family. His Aunt Faith came over and spoke to Ken for a moment, before introducing herself. Ken turned to Irene. "Aunt Faith and Uncle Andrew are offering us a ride out to Grandma's house for lunch. We can either ride with them in the automobile we rode in yesterday or take the buggy. Do you have a preference?" "Where do your grandparents live?" "About a mile from my parents." She thought about it for a moment. "I don't mind either way." Ken turned to his aunt. "We'll ride out with you and Uncle Andrew." "Sounds good. Now that the children are grown, we have more than enough room." Irene took each of the children by the hand and followed Ken out of the church, to the car. She was pleased to see how open and welcoming Ken's family really was toward her. Richard had always considered his mother to be friendly and loving, but she'd been different when he wasn't around. Of course, they hadn't been Christians. Irene was nervous sitting in the back seat with Carol on her lap as they drove to the country. Ken had made it clear his family was huge. He had 7 aunts and uncles, and all but one had settled in the area. He wasn't sure how many cousins he had and just shrugged when Irene had asked, saying he didn't want to have to sit and add them all up. When they got to the old farmhouse, Irene took a deep breath, before handing Carol to Ken. She got out of the car, smoothing down her blue church dress, and followed him up to the house. Once they were in, she was amazed at the level of activity. Women were hurrying in every direction as they set the table and peeled potatoes and baked bread. She was immediately embarrassed she hadn't brought anything as she watched the other women coming carrying pies and cakes. She spotted Maggie peeling a small mountain of potatoes and walked to her side. "May I help?" "Of course." Maggie reached out to get another knife and handed it to Irene. "Don't worry. I know we're overwhelming at first, but everyone here is thrilled Ken's married. I think you're going to be good for him." Irene glanced over her shoulder and saw Carol standing with a little girl around her age, touching the doll in her arms with awe. Ronald was outside on the lawn, throwing a ball with another boy. My children seem to like it here. Maggie grinned. All the kids like it here. There's plenty of room to run and play and lots of other children to do it with. Irene hadn't thought about how good it would be for her children to have a large extended family. She'd only thought about how nervous she was. Seeing her children fitting in so easily was a huge load off her mind. Have you met Ken's grandmother yet? Irene shook her head. I don't think so. She quartered the last of the potatoes and dropped the pieces into a large pot to be cooked. Maggie looked around and found Millie sitting in her rocker holding her youngest great-granddaughter, who was only 2 weeks old. She took Irene by the hand, dragging her to Millie. Mama, I want you to meet Ken's wife, Irene. Millie's eyes were clear as they looked up at Irene. Her hair had long since faded to gray, and her face bore the signs of age, but her eyes were as astute as ever. Her withered hand reached out and grasped Irene's. It's so good to meet you. I saw you and the children with Ken this morning. You have a beautiful family. Thank you. I've heard a lot about you. Especially about your cooking. Millie laughed. My children and grandchildren tell me my cooking is legendary. Look at me now. I sit here and let my daughters and daughters-in-law do all the work when I host lunch. Irene smiled. From what I've heard, you've done more than your share of cooking. Millie's eyes met Maggie's. How is our family so blessed to receive the sweet ones every time? God must truly love us. Irene flushed at the compliment while Maggie put her arm around Irene's shoulders. I'm just excited she came with 2 new grandchildren. Millie's eyes danced as she smiled up at Maggie. Every child is a blessing. The more the merrier. She squeezed Irene's hand, which she was still holding. I'd love to see you have more soon. Irene shook her head. I don't think that'll be happening. Millie laughed and nudged Maggie. We didn't think it would when we got married either, did we, Maggie? Maggie slowly shook her head. We didn't. Irene wondered what they meant by that, but let it go. She didn't really want the intimate details of her new in-law's marriage anyway. After lunch, Irene helped with the dishes. She was amazed by the atmosphere in the room as the women worked together. It was hot in the kitchen, but despite the heat, laughter filled the air. When she'd helped her mother or her former mother-in-law with the dishes, the mood was always dour. It was as if both of them hated to be in a room with her. Here, everyone seemed to genuinely enjoy being around each other. After the meal, the children had all gone outside to play, and through the window, Irene could see Ken squatting down as he talked to Ronald. There were several children surrounding them and Ken was talking to them all. She smiled slightly at the idea he was already doing his best to be a good father to her son. Maggie took the dish Irene handed her and dried it. He's always been good with children. Irene sighed. He's been very good to us. Better than I deserve. I don't know exactly what's going on in your marriage, and I'm not going to ask. It's none of my business. I will tell you, though, that I came here as a mail-order bride. I made Daniel wait before we consummated the marriage. I felt the need to get to know him better first. She handed off the dish she'd dried to Helen, her oldest daughter, before continuing. You're still grieving for your husband. Ken will expect nothing but what you can give him until you're ready. Ken's grieving, too. The sadness in his eyes makes me want to weep. Your first husband must have been a very special man. Irene felt a tear drifting down her cheek. He was. I miss him and I feel guilty for it. Then I feel guilty because I married Ken before I was finished grieving him. I feel like I betrayed Richard by marrying Ken, and I feel like I'm betraying Ken by missing Richard. She washed the pot and let the water out of the sink. I should have waited longer to marry, but we were about to move in with my parents, and they made it very clear they didn't want us there. Maggie dried the pot, thinking about Irene's words. That sermon was meant just for you today, wasn't it? Irene nodded. I need to work on letting go of the guilt, but I'm not sure how. Have you prayed about it? Irene shook her head. No, and I'm sure that's what's missing. I prayed for simple things, but nothing real since Richard died. I feel like I'm letting my relationship with God slip away from me. It's hard not to blame him for a loved one's death. She took Irene's hand and walked outside with her, heading off toward the cornfield where they could talk without being overheard. I think you need to ask Ken to start a nightly Bible reading with you. Daniel and I have been reading at least one chapter of the Bible together every night for the entire time we've been married. Do you think it helps? I do. I think it helps our relationship with each other and our individual relationships with God. They walked between 2 rows of corn which were knee-high. Your marriage is starting a lot like mine did in some ways. You and Ken are married, but still don't know one another. It's going to take time before you feel comfortable together, and having God be in your marriage can only help. Richard and I probably should have done something like that, but we were struggling so hard to make ends meet, and the babies came so quickly, we just never took the time. Maggie nodded. I do understand that, but if you do make the time, it'll be worth it. The more you know God, the more you'll see that your guilt is pointless. He wouldn't have given you my son as a way out of a bad situation and then wanted you to feel guilty over it. He's not that kind of God. Part of my problem is that I feel like I'm being a bad wife and should be intimate with Ken right away because wives are supposed to be, but I don't want to do that. It's really not fair to Ken. Did you go into the marriage with the understanding you'd be waiting for that part of your marriage, or did you announce that's how it would be after the wedding? He suggested it before the wedding. Maggie squeezed Irene's arm. He's not ready for it then, either. He probably has some guilt over marrying you as well. He does. We talked about it last night. Then just wait and see what happens. Be a good wife. Fix his meals and clean his house. Take care of your children. When it's time for more, you'll both know it. Irene stopped in the middle of the cornfield and hugged her mother-in-law. I never could have talked about this with my own mother. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Maggie turned back toward the house. Are you not close to your mother? Irene shrugged. I would like to be, but my parents aren't warm people. They made it clear that they did what they did for us, because it was their duty to God. Maggie made a face. I'm glad you and the children are here with us then. You'll be happier here. She looked at Irene as they walked. Do you want me to come over in the morning to help you with anything? Irene felt like she was asking too much. The house is fine. It's clean and lovely. I don't really need to make any changes. All I need to do tomorrow is go to the supermarket for the week. Let me come over and watch the children while you go. I'd like to get to know my new grandbabies. I can't ask you to do that. They're used to going everywhere with me anyway. You're not asking. I'm offering. I can't think of anything I'd rather do than spend time with them and get to know what they like. Irene bit her lip. Well, maybe. I may also have you help me make up a list of foods Ken is fond of. If I'm going to be here, I might as well cook things he enjoys eating. Well, why don't I go to your house around 10 tomorrow morning? We'll talk about different things he likes to eat, and we'll have lunch together. You can go to the market while I watch the kids. Irene nodded slowly. That would be nice. Also, letting Maggie spend an hour with them would help Irene know if she could leave them overnight. Ever since Daniel had suggested it, it was all Ronald could talk about. He loved the idea of spending a night with his new grandparents. They were walking toward the house to rejoin the others when Ken walked over to her. Irene was surprised by how tired he looked. Are you ready to go? She asked softly. Would you mind calling it a day? I'm exhausted, and I start back to work tomorrow. I'll go tell the kids. Are your Aunt Faith and Uncle Andrew ready to go? Aunt Faith said any time was fine with her. Irene smiled at Maggie. Thanks for the talk. I'll see you in the morning. She searched for her too in the mass of giggling, squealing children. When she found them, she told them quietly it was time to go home. Ronald made a face. But we're having fun, Mama. Irene nodded. I know you are. These are your new cousins, though, and you'll get to see them all the time. So we'll come back? She squeezed his hand. Say goodbye to your new cousins, and then meet us by the automobile. She found Carol sitting in the shade under a huge oak tree. She was holding a baby doll in her arms, cradling it, with a look of adoration on her face. "You need to give the doll back now. It's time for us to go." Carol stood up and reluctantly handed the baby doll back to an older cousin. Irene tried to remember who she belonged to, but had absolutely no clue. She smiled at the dark-haired girl who looked to be around 6. "Thank you for sharing your doll with Carol." The girl nodded solemnly. "You're welcome. Come back and play with us soon, Carol." Carol took Irene's hand as they walked to the Dodge. Both of the children had obviously truly enjoyed their day. Irene was thrilled to see how well they were fitting into their new environment. If she and Ken could just figure things out between them, she knew things would be good. She'd made the right choice to come here. Chapter 8. Ken was exhausted after his first long day at work. He walked through the streets, thinking about how things had been in the factory. So many of the men either weren't home from the war yet, or had been killed during the war, so the number of women working there surprised him. He'd never worked with women before, because most in the area had chosen to stay home and keep house rather than get a job outside the home. It had seemed strange going back to work, and doing the job that had once been so familiar. He'd enjoyed relearning how to do the tasks that had once been routine, but he missed the freedom of flying. He didn't miss killing, of course, but he missed soaring through the air. Thinking of flying brought his thoughts back to Richard, and that's where he didn't want his thoughts to be. He took a deep breath and continued on toward home, wondering what Irene had cooked for dinner. He walked in the house removing his hat, feeling strange in his civilian clothes. She'd really only seen him in his uniform before, and he wondered if he would remind her less of Richard now that he wasn't wearing the uniform they'd shared. Maybe it would help them learn to coexist. He was surprised to see his parents in the house along with his brother. "What are all of you doing here?" He really wasn't in the mood to play host for his family. He just wanted to eat and sit behind his newspaper all evening. Maggie walked over to him and took his arm, leading him into the kitchen. "Irene and I spent the day cooking, and we decided to have the family here for dinner tonight. I thought it would be good if she got to know just us before the next time we all went to your grandmother's." Irene's eyes met Ken's, and she immediately felt guilty for agreeing to his mother's suggestion. He looked so tired, and she knew she could have helped by keeping the house quiet for him. "We made your favorite." Ken smiled and nodded. "How much longer until it's time to eat?" He wanted to take a few minutes to run upstairs and splash some water on his face. Maybe if he did that, he could act like he was happy for everyone to be there. "About 10 minutes. Is that okay?" Irene's eyes searched Ken's face, worried she'd made him angry. 10 minutes is perfect. I'll be right back." He took the stairs 2 at a time, and locked the door on the bathroom, leaning against the sink. After spending days traveling and a day at church with family, he just wanted to be alone for a while. He turned on the cold water and cupped some in his hands, completely covering his face with it. He walked to his room and changed into some casual clothes. He didn't want to spend the evening smelling like cheese. By the time he walked back down the stairs after changing, he had prepared himself for the onslaught of family. He'd said a quick prayer for patience with them all. He just wasn't up for unexpected company this evening. He joined his brother and father, Ronald, and Carol in the living room while the women fussed in the kitchen. Daniel was holding Ronald and whispering something to him. The corner of Ken's mouth turned up as he watched his father with the little boy. He was obviously warming up to the role of grandpa. Ken walked to the chair Carol was sitting in and picked her up, sitting down with her in his lap. Carol turned to him and hugged him. "I'm glad you're home, Daddy." Ken blinked a few times. The children had referred to him as their daddy, but this was the first time one of them had actually called him Daddy. His heart melted. How had he thought he could live with 2 children and raise them, but not let them take a piece of his heart and keep it for their own? "I'm glad to be home, too." "What did you do today?" Carol scrunched up her little shoulders in thought. Ken grinned at the look on her face. She was wearing a pink dress with polka dots all over it, and had a big pink bow in her hair. "I played with Grandma, and I took a nap, and I ate breakfast, and I ate lunch, and I pushed Ronald." She looked down at her hands. I wasn't supposed to push Ronald. Ken bit his lip against the laugh threatening to come out. No, you weren't supposed to push Ronald. Why did you do that? He told me he was going to put Nellie in the oven. Ken was lost. Who's Nellie? Carol's eyes widened. She's my baby. He'd noticed Carol dragging a rag doll everywhere she went. Why did he say he was going to put her in the oven? Carol shrugged. I think it was 'cause I jumped on his bed and made it look all messy right after Mama made it. Well, why did you do that? Mama wasn't done making my bed yet. Ken chuckled at the 3-year-old's reasoning. Well, maybe next time you shouldn't jump on the bed at all. Carol narrowed her eyes. That's what Mama said. Did she tell you to say that? Ken simply hugged the little girl to him. He could see that coming home to this little girl every day was going to change his life. How could he possibly stay in a bad mood with her there? You could get hurt jumping on the bed. You're Mama and I don't want you to get hurt, so of course we say the same thing about it. Carol made a face, but didn't argue. Instead, she tucked her head under his chin and just snuggled into him. He looked up when Ronald approached. How was your day, Ronald? Ronald just shrugged. Okay, I guess. Did you have fun playing with Grandma? He nodded. She's really nice, and Mama went to the grocery store. She bought us lots of good stuff to eat. That's good. Ronald simply stood beside his chair while he held Carol. It was obvious he was unsure what to do with all these strangers in his house. Ken looked at George. Isn't it milking time? George shrugged. Not for another hour. We'll do it when we get home. Being a half-hour late isn't going to hurt anyone. Ken was relieved but did his best not to show it. He didn't want it to be obvious to his family he was ready for them to leave. If they were only going to milk a half-hour late, then they'd leave as soon as they were finished with dinner. Irene stepped into the room. Dinner's ready. Ken set Carol onto her feet. They all trooped into the kitchen. Irene and Maggie had crowded 7 chairs around his small rectangular kitchen table. Carol sat on one side of Irene and Ronald sat at the other. They all bowed their heads and Daniel automatically said the prayer for them. Thank you, God, for bringing our son home safely and for bringing a new daughter and new grandchildren into our lives. We treasure every minute we get to spend with them and thank you for giving us this opportunity. Thank you for this food and everything you provide on a daily basis. In the name of your precious son. Amen. For the first time, Ken realized Maggie and Irene had fixed chicken and dumplings. So many times while he'd been in the Air Corps, he'd gone to bed at night thinking of his mother's chicken and dumplings. To him, they meant home and everything was right with the world. He sat for a moment staring at the huge bowl in front of him. I think everyone here needs to find something else to eat, because I've been deprived of chicken and dumplings for a long time. He reached for the bowl and shoveled several spoons full onto his plate while his family laughed. Maggie's eyes met Irene's. He'd rather eat chicken and dumplings than anything else in the world. If you fix them for him at least once per week, he'll consider you the best wife alive. Ken shook his head. Don't lie to her, Mama. I expect them daily for at least a month. Maggie smiled. If I'd known you were coming, they'd have been waiting for you on Saturday. Irene smiled at Ken. Your mother showed me exactly how she makes them, so I'll be able to make them any time you want them. Ken sighed. Yes, you will be the best wife ever. As soon as they were finished eating, Irene walked to the oven and pulled out a pineapple upside-down cake. Ken stared at it and smiled. His mother had made the cake for his 10th birthday, and it had been his favorite ever since. Ken's eyes met Maggie's and he mouthed the words, "Thank you." She nodded and smiled from the other end of the table. As soon as the last crumb of cake was consumed, Maggie quickly helped Irene clear the table and then Irene pushed them out the door. I can do the rest. Get home to the cows. She impulsively hugged her mother-in-law. Thank you for helping me. Ken took both children into the living room and helped Ronald build a huge block tower. Carol sat hugging her baby and watched. Irene came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on the apron tied around her waist. That looks like fun. Ken smiled up at her. Thanks for cooking my favorite foods tonight. I really needed that. Irene nodded. You looked unhappy when you came in. I'm glad to see you smiling again. Ken sighed. I really just wanted to be alone when I got home. I was disappointed to see my family here, but now I understand why. Irene sat down on the edge of the sofa. I'm sorry I invited them. I could have just made it as your mother told me how, and then sent them home, but all I could think was she wouldn't have time to cook for your father and brother. You did the right thing. He reached up from where he sat on the floor with Ronald and squeezed her hand. Thank you. She smiled. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. I'll ask before inviting anyone to dinner again, though. Ken's eyes met hers. I'd appreciate that. I'm still sad a lot, and I just don't want to be around a lot of people. I feel the same way. She looked down at her hands, wondering how to broach the subject she felt they needed to discuss. When I talked to your mother yesterday, she told me your father started a nightly Bible reading with her as soon as they married. She said it helped her get used to marriage, and she felt it brought her closer to God. Ken nodded slowly. Would you like to do the same thing? I considered talking to you about a Bible reading, but wasn't sure how you'd feel about it. I think it's a good idea. Especially since we're not starting our marriage in a normal way. Does that make sense? He nodded. It does. Mama and Papa always did theirs as soon as the kids were in bed. Do you want to do the same? Sounds good. She glanced at the clock on the wall and knew it would be time to get the children into bed within the hour. I need to get them their baths, to get them ready for bed. She stood up and took Carol's hand. I'll come down once they're asleep. Ken sat in the living room, flipping through the pages of his Bible, trying to find a good place to start their reading. He kept getting distracted by the splashing noises coming from upstairs, though. Finally, he flipped through the pages, closed his eyes, and pointed. He landed on the 5th chapter of Matthew and verse 4, which said, Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. He closed his eyes for a minute and thanked God for providing just the right scripture, as he always did. Starting to read in the 5th chapter of Matthew might not be where he would usually start, but he knew that he and Irene needed that scripture more than any other at that moment. He walked upstairs to check on her progress with the children, and found Irene and both children sitting on the bed she shared with Carol, telling them the story of Noah's Arkansas, and they landed on Mount Ararat, and God sent a rainbow as a promise that he would never again flood the entire earth. Were the turtles saved in the ark, Mama? Ronald asked. She shook her head. No, turtles can breathe underwater, so they didn't have to be saved in the ark. What about giraffes? Were their necks long enough to stick out of the water so they wouldn't drown? Ronald lay with his head pillowed on her shoulder, and Carol was on her other side. Ken stood smiling at the picture they made. He wished he felt comfortable joining them, but he didn't yet. Irene smiled. No, their necks weren't long enough. They had to ride in the ark. She stroked Carol's hair, and Ken could see the little girl was almost asleep. It's time for prayers. Do you want to go first, Carol? Carol rolled onto her stomach and folded her hands. Dear God. Thank you for this day, and thank you for Mama and new Daddy and Ronald, and please give Daddy in heaven a kiss for me. In Christ's name we pray, Amen. Ken felt honored to be included in the simple prayer. She was such a sweet little girl. Ronald rolled over and folded his hands. Dear God. Thanks for giving us a new home to live in and a new daddy. We still love the old one, too, God. Make sure he knows we still love him. Please bless Mama and Carol and new daddy. In your son's name. Amen. Irene nudged Ronald out of the bed. Go get in your bed so I can tuck you in. She stayed for a moment with Carol, smoothing the covers over the child and kissing her forehead. Sweet dreams, Carol. Love you, Mama. I love you, too, baby. Carol's eyes caught Ken out of the corner of her eye. Her arms spread wide. Hug Daddy? Ken walked over to the bed and bent down to hug Carol and kissed her forehead as he'd just seen Irene do. "Sleep well, Carol. Love you, Daddy." Ken felt tears at the back of his eyes. He'd never had such a small sweet child say she loved him. "I love you, too, Carol." Irene smiled up at him and snagged his hand as she went into Ronald's room, pulling him along behind her. As he went into Ronald's room, he saw some of his old toys scattered around his room, including a toy train. He smiled down at it, remembering his fascination with trains when he'd been younger. Irene sat beside Ronald on the bed and tucked him in, kissing his forehead. "Sleep sweet. Love you, Mama." "I love you, too, Ronnie." Ronald looked to Ken, obviously expecting a hug and kiss goodnight from him as well. Ken approached the bed. For some reason, he felt more comfortable with little Carol. He hugged him and kissed his forehead. "Sleep well, Ronald." "I love you, Daddy." "I love you, too, Ronald." He stroked the boy's cheek and stood up, heading for the door. He was simply amazed by the emotions that welled up inside him at the simple ritual and being allowed to take part in it. He stepped into the hall and headed down the stairs, with Irene right behind him. Once they were down, he turned to her. "Did it bother you that I was part of that?" Irene shook her head, surprised he'd asked. "Of course not. I'm glad you're willing to be a father to them." He nodded, wondering if Richard was happy with what he was doing or if he thought he was trying to usurp his position with his children. Either way, he had committed to the path of being husband and father, and he was going to do the best job at both he could possibly do. He stepped into the living room and sat at one end of the couch, with the Bible in his lap. Irene sat on the opposite end watching him. "Do you have a Bible to follow along with?" She shook her head. "It's upstairs in the room where Carol's sleeping. I'll remember it tomorrow night." "That's fine." He scooted across the couch so they were sitting close enough they could share the Bible. "I wanted to start with Matthew chapter 5. I know it seems like a strange place to start, but I think you'll understand." At her nod, he said, "Let's pray first, and then we'll start the reading." Once she'd bowed her head, he said a simple prayer for them, and then read the chapter to her. Once he was finished, she sat looking straight ahead for a moment. "I felt like verse 4 was talking just to me." He nodded. "I did, too." There didn't seem to be much else to say, so he prayed for them again, and they said goodnight. For the first time since their marriage, he kissed her cheek when he said goodnight. After tucking the children in together, he felt like they were a team. Chapter 9. As the days passed, Ken and Irene settled into an easy routine. He worked 6 days per week, and was off on Sundays. She stayed home with the children and made certain she cooked his favorite foods. She became friends with his sisters, particularly Helen, because she had a little girl only a year younger than Carol and they had so much in common. She was on her way home from Helen's house with the 2 children in tow late on a Saturday afternoon in August when she stopped by the mailbox at the foot of her driveway. She'd sent her old pastor in Detroit a letter soon after arriving in Minnesota to let him know she and the children were okay, and had been exchanging letters with his wife ever since. She pulled 2 letters from the mailbox, and a smile lit up her face when she saw the first was from Mrs. Sheldon. She tucked it behind the second letter and froze on the spot. It was from Mary McGregor, her former mother-in-law. How did they find us? Not that she'd been trying to hide from them, and had told herself over and over she needed to send them a letter to let them know their grandchildren were all right, but she never had. She honestly hoped to never see or hear from the woman again. She walked toward the house with the children trailing after her. She needed to get dinner started, and was running late, so she set the letter down on the kitchen table and fried the chicken she'd planned to make to go with the potato salad and baked beans that were already chilling in the refrigerator. The children automatically went into the living room and played with their toys while she worked. As soon as the chicken was in the frying pan with the lid on, she walked back to the table and sat down. She picked up the letter from Mrs. Sheldon first, slid it open and read it. "Dear Irene, I was happy to receive your last letter. It sounds like you and the children have made a place for yourselves there in Minnesota. Ken's family sounds delightful, and we may take you up on your offer to visit sometime soon. I do need to let you know I received a visit from your former mother-in-law yesterday morning. She was every bit as pleasant as you described her to be. She'd already been to your parents' house and had been informed they didn't have your address, so they sent her here. I thought about it long and hard, but I felt like they had the right to know where their grandchildren are. I know you told me you planned to write them, but hadn't gotten up the courage yet. I wanted you to know you should expect a letter from them any day. Pastor Sheldon and I will continue to pray for you and the children. God bless, Alice Sheldon. Irene folded the letter neatly and put it back in the envelope. She liked to share the letters she received with Ken after the children were asleep. She stood up to flip the chicken over and sat back down, picking up the other letter. Saying a quick prayer for courage, she opened the envelope and pulled out the single sheet of paper within. Dear Irene, I understand you have remarried already. Do you not think it's a slap in the face to your former mother-in-law to hear this from your pastor? Why did you not at least inform my husband and me that you were taking our precious grandchildren out of state? Why would you even marry so soon after my son was laid in his final resting place? Richard was a wonderful, perfect man, and I cannot believe you could have found a replacement for him so quickly. Have you no loyalty? I want you to know how much Mr. McGregor, and I hate the fact you've not only remarried but have moved to Minnesota of all places. We will be coming to see you in September and fully expect you to allow the children to return to Michigan with us. You are obviously an unfit mother if you remarry so quickly. Your former mother-in-law, Mary McGregor. Irene blinked a couple of times before returning the letter to its envelope. What right did she have to say Irene was unfit? She'd gone to her mother-in-law asking for help to pay for food not long after she'd received word of Richard's death, and the money stopped coming in. Her mother-in-law had informed her she would take the children and raise them if Irene was unable to, but had flat refused to give her either food or money. Irene had sold her engagement ring that afternoon so her children could eat. Her children would never go live with that mean-spirited woman. She stood and took the chicken off the stove and let it drain onto a plate with a towel on it. She hurried to the refrigerator and took out the potato salad she'd made before going to Helen's house that morning and set it on the table and quickly got out the dishes to set the table. She removed the cold-baked beans from the refrigerator and put them on the table as well. She didn't realize she was crying until she looked up as the back door opened and she saw Ken standing just inside the kitchen looking at her with surprise. He walked across the kitchen and pulled her into his arms, something he'd never done before. Tell me what happened, he whispered against her hair. For a moment she stood stiff in his arms, and then she allowed herself to be comforted by him. She collapsed against him, her arms going around him in return. She couldn't speak, she was shaking so badly. After a minute, she pulled back and looked up at him. I received a letter from Richard's mother today. He sighed. Did you ever write her? Irene looked down and shook her head. She'd told him she was afraid of the woman's reaction if she sent a letter to her and explained she'd remarried. Where's the letter? She walked to the counter and picked it up, handing it to him. He sat down at the table and read the letter while she finished putting everything on the table for their evening meal. She watched him out of the corner of her eye as she poured milk into their glasses, and finally she sat down beside him. He looked up after finishing, his eyes flashing with something she'd never seen there. She's not taking our children. No, she's not. Why did this letter upset you so much then? Because she said some things about me that I've already been saying about myself. I shouldn't have married again so soon, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. She explained about how she'd gone to Mrs. McGregor asking for help after Richard had died and the woman's response. Ken shook his head. I want you to know that if anything ever happened to me, my parents would not treat you that way. She laughed. If you were to die, your family would do everything they could to help me keep this house, and would never let any of us go without a single meal. No, they wouldn't. He reached out and took her hand between his. My family loves you. She smiled. Thanks. Sometimes I need a reminder that I'm lovable. She looked into his kind green eyes, and for the first time, saw only a man who gave everything to her and her children. He'd finally become someone other than Richard's friend to her. He was a good man all on his own. She felt a flutter in her stomach as she realized she was developing feelings for this husband of hers. "You're very lovable. Any man would be proud to call you his wife." His eyes were intense as they stared into hers, as if he was seeing her for the first time as well. She bit her lip nervously, feeling that somehow their relationship had just changed. "We really need to eat before the food gets cold." He dropped her hands and nodded, watching her as she put the chicken on the table and went to call the children. What had just changed between them? He'd never really been aware of her as a beautiful woman before that moment, but now, all of a sudden, he couldn't take his eyes off her. After their prayer, he asked how their day had gone, and Ronald let out a long-suffering sigh. "I had to spend the day with Aunt Helen and Nancy again. There's no one for me to play with at Aunt Helen's house." Ken's mouth turned up into a smile. "But you like Aunt Helen, don't you?" Ronald shrugged. "She's okay. She bakes good cookies." Ken laughed softly. "Well, that's important." He turned to Carol. "And how was your day?" "It was great. Aunt Helen let me help make cookies, and I got to play with Nancy and her new baby." "That sounds like a lot of fun. What did your mama do?" "She helped make cookies, too." Ken's eyes met Irene's, and they were full of laughter. "I'm glad to hear you helped." Irene shook her head. "I don't even know if Carol realized I was there. She was having so much fun with Nancy and Aunt Helen." "You were there, Mama. I saw you." Carol's words had the adults laughing. After supper, Ken played with the children in the living room while Irene did the dishes. She listened to the voices coming in from the other room and couldn't help but smile. Ken had become a good father to both of the children. He obviously adored them and they loved him as well. From the squeals she heard, she could tell the children were once again tackling Ken to the floor and bouncing on him. The first time she'd seen him play with them that way, she'd been worried someone would get hurt, but Ken had laughed it off. He said his father had played with him the same way when he was small. Once the dishes were dried, she walked into the living room and found the three of them sitting on the couch together with Ken in the middle. Each of the children was snuggled up beside him and he was reading them the story of Moses from the Bible storybook Millie had given them. She sat down in a chair perpendicular to the couch to listen to the story. Glancing at the clock, she saw it was almost time for them to go to bed. She'd taken a lot longer than usual with the dishes, because her mind simply wasn't on the task at hand. It was on Ken. What was she doing falling in love with her husband? When the story was over, Ken asked the children some questions about it, and they answered eagerly. Irene was thrilled to see how well they'd taken to learning the stories from the Bible. After they were finished, Irene stood up. "Bedtime." Both children groaned loudly, making it clear they thought they should be able to stay up as late as they wanted. Irene just laughed. "That's not happening, and you both know it." Ken stood and followed them up the stairs. He'd made it a point to be involved in their bedtime rituals since the night he'd started back to work. He knew it was a good bonding time with the children, and he wanted them to think of him as their father. Once both children were tucked into bed, Ken stood looking down at Irene, a little unsure of what to do. They had their own nighttime ritual where they read the Bible together, but he was feeling so much more attracted to her than before, he almost felt that it was wrong to be alone with her. Of course, she was his wife, and it wasn't wrong, he argued with himself. They went back down the stairs together and he got his Bible from the table next to the couch. "We finally finished the Gospels. Do you want to go on to Acts, or do you want to read something else?" "I'd love to finish out the New Testament if you don't mind. I've never read it all the way through." She moved to sit close beside him on the couch as she always did. They'd gotten used to sharing a Bible during their reading, and had never bothered to bring the other Bible down. For the first time, she was aware of how close they sat together. Her hand brushed against his as she took her corner of the Bible to hold it open. She looked up to find him looking down at her. "What?" she asked, blushing. He raised his hand to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. "I was just thinking about how beautiful you are." She let out a short laugh. "I'm not beautiful." His hand stayed on her cheek, his eyes looking deeply into hers. "You are to me." He studied her for a minute, and then asked, "Would you mind if I kissed you?" He'd kissed her on the cheek several times during their marriage, but the only time he'd kissed her on the lips was during their short wedding ceremony. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to kiss her. Her face grew serious and she nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'd like that." Slowly, he lowered his head to hers and brushed her lips briefly with his own. He wanted to keep kissing her, but he forced himself to back off, and looked down at the Bible they held. Acts chapter 1. His voice was husky and shaky as he read. She rested against him, her head on his shoulder. When they were finished, he laid the Bible back in its spot on the end table and turned to her. "I think maybe we need to talk about our marriage." She swallowed and nodded slowly. She was attracted to him. She wasn't sure when or how it had happened, but she was ready for their marriage to move on to the next step. How could she tell him that without actually saying the words, though? She watched him, waiting for him to say something more. "When I married you, it was to help you and the children. I was still so deep in my own grief for Richard that I couldn't think of you as anything more than his widow." She could see his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed, giving indication of how nervous he was. "I want more from our marriage now. I'm not saying today, but would you think about it? Let me know when you're ready." She looked into his eyes, knowing he was embarrassed to even bring up the topic. At least she'd been married before, and had an idea how things would be between them. She was certain she was the only woman he'd ever even kissed. She reached up to stroke his cheek. "I don't need to think about it, Ken. I love you." His eyes widened in surprise. "You do?" She grinned. "I do. I do, too." She wound her hand around his neck and pulled his head down for a kiss. "Thank you." He pulled back, looking down at her. "For what?" "For marrying me and accepting my children as your own. For giving me the time I needed to finish grieving Richard. For being a man I could love and spend the rest of my life with." He smiled. "I love you." She settled her head against his shoulder and just enjoyed the feel of his arm around her shoulders. She said a silent prayer, thanking God for sending such a good man into her life. She knew she didn't really deserve his love, but she was thankful for it all the same. Epilogue. Irene stood nervously at the edge of the platform at the train station in St. Paul. Ken was at her side with the children between them. They watched as the train pulled into the station. Ken reached over the heads of Ronald and Carol to stroke her cheek. "It's going to be okay." "I hope so." She saw the McGregors get off the train and search the crowd before making a beeline for them. Mrs. McGregor didn't say a word to Irene as she hugged first Ronald and then Carol. "How are my precious babies?" she asked in her sugary sweet voice she always used with the children. Mr. McGregor shook hands with Ken. "Terry McGregor," he said. Ken met the man's eyes, shaking his hand firmly. "Ken Stevens." Mr. McGregor tilted his head to the side for a moment, obviously thinking about something. "Are you the young man Richard talked about in his letters? The one who flew with him?" Ken nodded. "Yes, sir, I am." He waited for the man to berate him as Irene's parents had, and as he'd berated himself so many times since Richard had died. Mr. McGregor clapped him on the shoulder. "Thank you for being such a good friend to my son. He had nothing but good to say about you, son." Mrs. McGregor's eyes narrowed as she saw the affection her husband was showing to Ken. "So he died, and you decided you could just go and marry his wife, did you?" Ken cleared his throat and said in a soft voice, "Before every flight, Richard asked me to promise to take care of his family if anything were to happen to him. When I was back stateside, the first thing I did was go see Irene to make sure she and the children were getting on okay. When it was clear they weren't, I knew I needed to marry her to take care of her and the children. She was completely alone in the world, with no family willing to help her. I'm a Christian, and I keep my word." "How dare you say she was alone in the world? She had us." Mrs. McGregor's voice was high-pitched as she all but squealed the words. "And did you give her money for food for the children? Did you lift a finger in any way to help her?" Ken already knew the answer, but wanted to hear the woman admit it herself. Mrs. McGregor's hand went to her chest. I was caught up in my grief for my only son. I wasn't thinking straight. Were you thinking straight when you sent a letter saying you'd be taking the children from us? His eyes were clear as they stared her down. The children were his, and she wasn't taking them anywhere. Mr. McGregor's eyes widened and he turned on his wife. You did what? How could you do something you knew would bring Richard pain if he were alive? He turned back to Ken without waiting for an answer. I'd like to apologize for my wife's behavior. She was grieving, but that's no excuse for sending a letter like that. Ken nodded curtly. Let's get your things, and I'll drive you to my parents' house. You'll be staying with them while you're here. Mr. McGregor shook his head. I can't believe you even bothered to meet us at the station with a threat like that. I appreciate your hospitality. Thank you for making sure Irene and the children were cared for. Mrs. McGregor walked beside Irene toward the automobile they'd borrowed from Ken's Aunt Faith. You think you've won, don't you? She hissed at her. Mr. McGregor turned around and glared at his wife. There was never anything to win. You will treat our son's wife with respect or I'll never bring you to see our grandchildren again. He stopped in his tracks and took his wife's arm. Is that understood? She sighed. Fine. Irene smiled to herself. She'd avoided the confrontation she was certain she'd have to have. She said a prayer of thanks as they got into the Dodge. God certainly was looking out for her.